Projects at home, and I was glad to get some of them done.
All right. Welcome to Iola. I want to open this meeting. I want to call the meeting to order, and we'll start with the introduction of commissioners and staff, starting on my far left.
Emmerich Cross, Kansas City.
Warren Gefeller, Russell.
Gary Hazlett, Lakin.
I'm Gerald Lauber from Topeka.
Aaron Ryder, Columbus.
Lauren Quayle Sill, Hutchinson.
Troy Spohr, Oakley.
Sheila Kemis, Admin Support, Pratt.
Chris Jamison, Legal Counsel.
Brad Lillis, Secretary.
Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary, Pratt.
Okay, we do have at least one addition to the agenda. I think we have a new revised edition,
Yes.
differing in that we have the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative.
Yes, it will be Jason Deal, though, instead of Stewart presenting that.
Okay, that'll be fine. Is there anything else?
No.
All right. Let's look at the minutes. If there are no additions or corrections, would anybody care to make a motion that we approve the minutes?
Move.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. We approve the minutes. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. At this time, we would welcome and encourage public comment on non-agenda items. If something is not on the agenda tonight, we would like to have you and encourage you to come up and give a discussion. When you do, please come to the microphone, state your name and where you're from. It's important that Sheila be able to get that down so it can be accurately reflected in the minutes. So does anybody have anything they'd like to discuss today?
Hello, I'm David Lauber from over at Yates Center. I just wanted to speak to you all today about the deer hunting situation and permits. I know it's been brought up that the deer population is smaller than it used to be. In southwest Woodson County, where we're at, deer population is increasing. I'm fixing fences about every other day that the deer have tore up. It's been mentioned, so, well, hey, you know, it's not the cattle doing it, because there's no cattle in the pasture at the time. It's getting ready to put cattle in. They are destroying our crops. They're overpopulated. And then we had 4 hunters that was going to come in from Texas this spring or fall and archery hunt. For some strange reason, they got drawn out. And had a neighbor who had 2 hunters got drawn out. And we did some calculations based on what non-resident deer hunters pay, what they were going to pay us and our neighbor, not to mention what they was going to pay to the city Yates Center, because they's all going to be staying there, was roughly $13,000. It was lost to the economy, to the wildlife and parks, to the landowners, and to the town where they'd all be staying. The deer are overpopulated. I can go hunting. I didn't get to hunt this year, first time in 40 years, obviously for physical reasons. But I could go out on a morning hunt, 3-4 hours, and I see a minimum of 20 deer. I don't set in a blind. I don't set at a feeder. This is walking through a patch of timber of roughly 80 to 90 acres. One of your own employees 2 years ago counted 80 deer on 30 acres. A year ago this month, my brother drove 3 miles and counted 60 deer. And he said there's some he knew he didn't see. We got to do something to get the populations down. They're doing, like I said, damage. And then you're talking about chronic wasting disease. You get overpopulated. Our deer sizes are getting smaller. because normally rut's over by the time rifle season starts. We still got bucks chasing does as of last week. My brother and I both witnessed it. We got too many deer, they're getting smaller. They're getting younger, and we just need to do something. And I had a request from the guys in Texas. He sent me an email of questions. He said since he got drawn out this year and got a preference point, would he be able to get a tag next year? And if they applied as a group, which is what they did this year, apparently somebody didn't make the list or something, so the whole group got denied. He's wanting to know if they apply, how should they apply, as a group or as individuals? And then also wanting to know, and this has always been a problem with me, you know, my last name, so you know I've had a lot of discussions. Landowners, we're feeding your deer. Realize, I know they're not your deer till it comes deer season. Car accidents, damage, well, they're wildlife. But when it comes to deer season, they're wildlife and parks deer. And to help feelings, people such as myself that feel the same way, I do not understand two things. Why a landowner cannot get a tag at no charge. I know I can get it for $20, $15. But yet, it's costing us time and money long more than what that $20 is. I don't know how many of you here have a livelihood that depends on farming and cattle. But it's doing a lot to hurt us and kill us. And they're still having car deer accidents. I work here in Iola at night, and I see dead deer up and down the road all the time. So the population isn't low. And the other thing I'd like to ask, why a landowner cannot get a tag and then turn around and sell it possibly to a lease hunter. That would help the farm income, because as you all know, farming is not real great right now. But personally, it cost us $4,000 last fall that we could have used and then also got deer. My brother's put me in charge of our hunting policy. Any leasees that come in, if they want to shoot a buck, that's fine, but they're required to also shoot a doe. Because the only way we're going to get the population down is get rid of some does. It wouldn't break my heart if you went back like it used to be. You got a buck tag, but then for a year or two, you only could get a doe tag. I can remember my dad when the deer first came in. It was in the mid-70s. We were feeding cattle. A bunch of 10 ran through the timber. My dad slammed on the brakes. He grew up there. Gerald's dad grew up there. That was the first time he'd ever seen deer on our property. And they have did nothing since but multiply. I know we can't do anything about beaver, the damage they do, armadillos, everything like that. But the deer can be managed if we could come up with some solution to get the deer number down.
Okay.
Because it is big business for the state of Kansas.
On the one question you had about the preference point, how does that work?
Mike can answer that.
So 91% of the non-residents who applied last year drew permits. Those that didn't draw got a preference point. So anybody with a preference point will draw a permit next year. If they want to apply for, as a buddy, as a group, all of them need that same status. So if they all have one preference point, they will be virtually guaranteed that they will all draw. But if one of them in the group doesn't have a preference point, it will drop back to that. So they all need to apply for the exact same permit type and unit and things like that. And then if they've all got one preference point, they will be drawn. Virtually they're guaranteed of a permit next year with one preference point.
Well, yeah, that's fine, but I don't understand. I'm a deer hunter. Why, I mean, I don't know what a non-resident deer tag costs. I assume about $500. to me, if these non-residents want to come in and lease our land to hunt, I'm more than glad to let them. And there's one other thing I don't understand, and I'll get out of here. When they got denied, they got an email, letter, whatever, said, oh, you were denied, but by the way, we're taking $25 of this $500 you sent in for admin fees. To me, it's all done by computer, a few keystrokes. These guys should be able to get all their money back. Because you're still making money off of them even though they're not hunting up here. And to me, that don't seem right. So I think I've pretty well got it all off my chest. I'm
All right.
sorry if I embarrassed you, Gerald.
Well,
Mr. Chair, I can address a few of those.
I will say this is not the first time David and I have had this discussion. And I reserve the right to disagree on some of this, and some of it I see as points. So go ahead.
Yeah, so a few things. You made a lot of good points. First, our deer expert, Levi Jasper, will be here later on, and he's our person who keeps track of population trends. Certainly, we all understand there can be pockets of higher numbers, but he'd appreciate knowing what you've experienced there, and he's glad to share with you our best data for what's going on around here. Those data, including observations like yours, do affect how we set the standards for different units. So that's valuable to us. So we appreciate that. In terms of depredation, you mentioned that we have a lot of our law enforcement folks here, as well as our wildlife people. We have gotten more liberal over time with issuing depredation tags, and our folks have a lot of flexibility in helping you with that to remove those unwanted deer. You're exactly right. Does are what we need to target when we want to reduce populations. And so we encourage, typically non-residents aren't interested in shooting does, but our residents are. So some landowners figure out a way where they can have non-residents come in and hunt horns and then allow local residents to come in and harvest those does to help you out and help them out too. So that's a good deal. You mentioned landowner transferable tags. We had a lot of discussions. I had discussions all this morning about that. Our concern about that is it makes it difficult for us to know the numbers that are under the proposals we've dealt with so far, to know the numbers of deer that actually would be able to be harvested, and that's a concern of ours because that's really important that we try to maintain a sweet spot where the quality of deer remains high, our reputation remains good, and as a landowner, then you can continue to require top dollar for that land that you're leasing. That's really important, and that's where the greatest value is, and not in a tag by itself. I mean, I own land. I could get, under that scenario, I could get a tag, but I guarantee they wouldn't want to come and hunt on my land. They want to come and hunt on yours. So the value is your land. That's really what you're selling. We are trying to keep the success rate high, like Mike said, over 90%. So we feel like that's pretty darn good, especially compared to some other states to the west that you wait years and years for a tag. Mike addressed group permits. There is a strategy involved, and we're glad to coach you on that to help you use the system most effectively. But we would love to talk with you more. And I know when Levi gets here, he'd like to hear what you have to say, and we're glad to share our data with you. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Is there any other public comment on non-agenda items? Please.
I would like to.
Could you state your name, please?
Grant Corley, Westphalia, Kansas, Anderson County. I live on the Anderson-Colby County line, and in our area, we've got too many deer also. I can identify what he's talking about. We've been fixing electric fences every day, day after day. They just keep running through them. My sister has 80 acres of ground, and we had a little deer walk this first weekend, and we walked 35 deer out of that 80 acres that we saw. We know some probably went out the north side of it. So there's no shortage of deer. And I think you do have some people out of state that would be glad to buy a doe tag and bring in some more cash for everybody. You know, when you bring a hunter in, he has to stay somewhere, he has to eat somewhere. He has to buy some fuel to get there and get home. And I think Kansas just will have some of that money as sending it somewhere else. That's the main thing of what I've got. There's several little issues, but I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you.
And I thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, appreciate your comments. We have been talking about exactly the thing you just mentioned about the idea of offering non-residents just a doe tag. And so a lot of the folks in this room have commented in the last few weeks as a part of that discussion. And what I heard, and I tried to summarize that today for one of our legislators who was asking, and what I heard was that in our experience, there is very low demand for non-residents to come in just to shoot a doe. I mean, they are very interested in hunting some of our trophy bucks, but in the course of a year, what I heard from our staff is you could count the number of non-residents who are interested in that on one hand as far as the requests that we see. So very low to come just for a doe, right? That's our experience. Does anybody else, I'm trying to summarize what I heard from our department. Anybody else in our department, then we'll be glad to visit with you.
Okay, do you have a comment? You want to come up?
My name is, excuse me, my name is Wes Troll. I'm from Richmond, Kansas, the Anderson Coffee County area. This morning before I attended this particular function, I spent, this is the third day, fixing electric fence. We don't have a deer shortage population. A couple of things I would disagree with, sir. I think there is an interest in non-residents hunting antlerless animals. I'm going to Texas to hunt axis deer, antlerless. I have no interest in an antlered animal. Mr. Miller, you made the comment concerning the group permit. You did an excellent job of describing that particular permit. I wish you would do as good a job in your publication, because when you read the publication, it says you can apply as a group. If one individual draws a tag, the entire group draws a tag. It makes no mention of the fact that the individual with the least opportunity to draw the tag is chosen to represent the group. The entire group has to ante up and pay the entrance fee, but everybody else is set on the sideline, and that one individual represents the group. That's almost misleading, I guess would be the nice word to say. There have been several cases in my experience where a father and a son would apply for a permit, father, cousin, whatever. One individual would draw the tag, the other individual wouldn't. They've asked me several times, well, can I come hunt a doe? Well, the current situation, the current system that you have, you give that doe tag away. Human nature is you only covet those items which you value. You're giving that tag away. It has no value to that individual. How many tags, if the individual, for example, I drew a tag in Kansas, had someone who wanted to come with me, they didn't draw. If they could draw a doe tag or purchase a doe tag over the counter, that would allow that individual to come on site, enjoy the resource, experience the resource, spend dollars in our rural communities, spend dollars that rural Kansas desperately need. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to drive through Kansas and see that rural Kansas is not doing that well. And it's not just a 1 or 2 year function, it's a long time function. You know, in many cases, it's last person out, please turn off the lights so the thing doesn't blow away. In my opinion, I feel that the department in many cases does not manage the deer herd. They are using the non-resident tags as an opportunity to manage resource or to manage access. My feelings being that if you deny this individual who had the opportunity to lease property, now all of a sudden those individuals from Texas or Arkansas or Bumbuck, Egypt, wherever, are willing to come in and spend dollars to lease that individual's property. If they cannot draw that tag, that discourages them from making that transaction. I feel in many cases the department feels like, well, if we discourage a non-resident from gaining access to that property, a resident will have a better opportunity to gain access to that property. Well, the problem with that scenario is in many cases that resident, which I understand they need to hunt, they need recreation, but when I make an agreement with a banker, he does not ask me, he says, well, sir, how much recreational opportunity are you going to allow your fellow residents? They don't care. They just want the note serviced. If that resident, Chris, if you want to lease ground from me, trust me, I'll take your dollar. We can come to an agreement. In my opinion, you are limiting the opportunity, the economic opportunity for the landowner to realize the full value of his or her property. And I feel like you're managing access, not necessarily the deer herd. And I'm not a deer biologist, I am not a deer expert, except on the ground that I own and operate on. And I know that a lot better than the department does. I'm sorry, I'm there 365 days a year. I see what happens on an ongoing basis. And the current system limits my ability to properly manage that ground. And as I said, I think that you're undervaluing your antlerless tags. I think there is a demand. I think if you present it to the public, I think you would be surprised at the response that you might receive. As I said, currently, if you give it away, it has no value. I think you would be surprised if you put that tag available and make it to where those individuals have an opportunity to come to the state and support our Main Street merchants and support our small towns. The landowner, everyone talks about the North American model of wildlife management. It is the Bible of most people in this profession. But we have a tendency to conveniently pick and choose what that model says. Mr. Leopold, who was the god of wildlife management, talked about the value of private property, talked about private property would have to be involved to allow the furthering of wildlife. Far too many times we ignore that those statements. Theodore Roosevelt, the father of the national park system, made the same statement. The value of private property is the future and value of wildlife in this country. Let's just be honest about it, especially in a state where 98% of the ground is in private ownership. But Mr. Miller, honestly, like I said, I wish in your rules and regulations you would be as clear in stating the issues on that group permit as you were here at this meeting, sir. I appreciate your time. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay. Do we have another gentleman that wants to talk back there? Yeah, please.
Adrian Johnson, West Fayette, Kansas. I pay $130 a year to try to help control the deer, and that's not near enough. We've got leased ground by us that they will kill a trophy buck or nothing. And that's what's wrong with our crops. And if the tag goes up anymore, I'm going to go back to the way we used to control them. Set them deer stands out in that bean field, take care of them when they go to eating. Thank you.
Okay. Any other? Yes, sir.
Dean Clare. I'm here with the Kansas Livestock Association. And you know, in previous years that we've spent a lot of time wanting transferable permits. But really today we're here to echo the voices that have already been said. And we'd like to see the option for doe tags to be permitted to non-residents. You get a group of 5 buddies that are coming up to go hunting and one doesn't get a buck tag, we'd still like him to at least be able to come up and shoot a doe with the group. We know that majority of these come for the purpose of shooting that trophy buck, but we have a lot of members and landowners in the state who have now developed a business model where their operation depends on the income from these fee hunting opportunities. And although that doesn't guarantee them an income with the doe tag, it at least allows that relationship to be sustained through all of that. And I think that's the biggest point that we'd like to drive home for our membership.
Okay, a non-resident can obtain a doe tag now. It's just, the rules are they have to have a buck tag before they can get one. And what you're recommending is that if you were unsuccessful in drawing your buck tag, you would still be able to get a doe tag in those areas to where we feel like we have too many deer. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir, essentially.
And that's exactly what our discussion has been, is how that would work, what are the pros and cons. And I felt like we had a pretty good discussion, but I really appreciate these comments. Those help us understand better what's going on, particularly in this area. That one of the concerns we have, of course, every regulation we have to be able to enforce. One of the challenges is sometimes there's a sense in a group that even if you don't have a buck tag, if that buck comes across, you can take it and somebody else will tag it. I've heard people talk about that. And that's something we're trying to avoid. Right. And while we'd love to have those folks come in and enjoy all we have to offer and spend their money while they're here, we're concerned about how we manage that. And so that's a difficulty. So right. Those are the kind of discussions we're having. If people have insight into that, then we'd love to hear it. I mean, currently, anyone can participate in that late season, so non-residents could come in and shoot a doe late, but we know that doesn't coincide with when their friends might be coming in to do the buck hunt. But to your point, clarity and good coaching in the application process for those group permits is really important. And that's
Sir, just, I don't mean to take it, I apologize for speaking out of turn. The logic that you just used, if that's the logic we're going to use, I need your car keys right now. Because I know sometime during the next week, you're going to violate a traffic law. And to avoid that violation, give me your keys. That way you can't violate, and we don't have to worry about it. And I understand your concern and the department's concern. Yes, will there be violations? I hate to say it, but yeah, there will be. Do I think they'll be rampant? No. You cannot manage a resource with the idea that, well, a violation is going to occur, so let's just strike that.
No, and believe me, that's not it. We're trying to make good, prudent decisions to allow our law enforcement folks to be successful. They already have a pretty daunting task if you look at our regulations with the different kind of permits that they have to manage. They're trying to do a good job and be fair to the folks we're trying to encourage out there. We know it's not, we're never going to get 100%, but we want to be wise in the regulations we put forth to give them the best chance of being fair. And we get a lot of complaints from people that say folks are breaking the law. Can't you guys do something about this? And so we're sensitive to that too. So we're trying to make regulations that are clear, that are enforceable, and fair, understanding they're not going to be 100%. We get that. We get that.
Well, once again, you made the statement, well, we don't want to have a doe permit because if doe permit's available, they'll party hunt and they'll violate. Well,
No.
that's the logic.
Also remember
They may
what I
already
said-
be doing that anyway.
Yeah, right. And
So-
also, initially, remember, well, it's a larger conversation. We're glad to have it, but we do want to encourage non-residents to come
We've been
in.
having this conversation for 20 years.
Okay, yeah. So hopefully we can come to some resolution, some wisdom about it. We have concerns, but it'd be fun to talk at the break and be able to get, more of your experience and because this does benefit us. It helps us, and we appreciate, we were meeting with Kansas Livestock Association just a little bit ago at your annual meeting, and we're trying to get the best information we can. We'll improve over time with your good input, so we appreciate it.
We're also meeting today in an area that has a plethora of deer. We meet in other areas of the state where the concern is the population is declining. And so the social issues differ from one area to another. And while I grew up on a cattle operation too, and I have a good feeling for agriculture, we also have a tremendous number of constituents who vote and will push the legislature around, who, there's a lot of people who really resent that they don't have a place to hunt anymore. There's nothing we're going to be able to do with that because it's 98% public ground. But it is not universally popular that we have a lease. On the other hand, I think Chris has pointed out that probably half of our ground leased is leased by residents anyway. So I'm not sure it's all based on non-residents. They tend to be the ones to pay the most. But there are two sides that this commission and the agency has to deal with because there are a lot of people that don't own land. They vote and they have the ability to pepper us with emails, and we want to pay attention to what they have to say as well.
Thank you for your time. I just wanted to say that I hope we can continue a relationship that allows us to help you build something that allows some sort of option for our landowners.
Thank you.
Is there any other public comment on non-agenda items? Well, get to work, Miller.
I would make one comment. And you mentioned the $25, they don't get refunded, and it is an application fee. And this would address a point you made as well. We have a full licensing staff in our basement at Pratt, and those people spend almost the whole month of April on the phone with non-residents who are applying for permits. And I promise you, they do explain those buddy permits to them that way. It may not be explained in print as well as it should be, and I apologize for that, if that has been confusing for you. But we do spend an awful lot of time with visiting with non-resident deer applicants to try to get those permits the right way. I don't want to throw those people under the bus because they do work really hard. I just wanted to point that out, that they do try to get that done. So, I mean, it is a changing, has not been the same since this new permit system went into place. The demand for non-resident deer permits has increased in this part of the state over the last 2 years. I don't know that we could have predicted that, and that has been why you've seen suddenly hunters not drawing permits. So it has changed, and I don't know if it's shifting from one part of the state to the other. We did see the most non-resident applications this year than we ever had. So it has increased, demand has increased, but it's more increased in this part of the state than it has in others.
Do you have to have that to get that?
I remember sitting in meetings, when we did away with the transferable limits. And at that time, the department, when the initial system, when this system was introduced, I can remember taking notes, and I can remember sitting through the meetings, and the statement was made, this department will have a 5-year rolling average of non-resident applications that will form a base number. That base number can be either increased or decreased by 50% based on deer population. Since this system has come into place, I haven't seen that flexibility in numbers. I was just curious if that policy is still being followed by the department, or if it has gone by the wayside. So
I think the policy is such that we at one point in time had a maximum level of like 16% that was during that.
Time, when this policy was, when this department, when this system was put in place, at that time they said we would break the non-resident number completely away from the resident population.
And I think that's the case, isn't it, Mike?
Yes, I mean, we're at about almost just under 22,000 non-resident permits are available in the draw. When we started out, I think we were about 18,000. But this is the very first year that we didn't have leftovers. So what we were looking at that time was meeting demand, and that was what we had. Like there was 7 adjustment factors to set those permit numbers. I think one of the concerns, and we've talked about it a little bit here, is resident opportunities, and we've seen a marked decrease in the number of resident deer hunters over the last 5 years. A lot of that can be attributed to difficulty in getting access. I mean, I would love.
There are a lot of factors on declining hunter numbers.
No, I'm not talking about just hunter numbers. I'm talking about resident deer hunter numbers, and we have seen that decline. Now, you're right, there is no one thing that affects that.
There's no one.
I agree with you, but when we're talking about deer population control, I'd love to have you guys bring in a bunch of kids from town to be able to shoot does. There's you can get 5 doe permits in this area. So there's tools in place, and in addition to that, you have the depredation tags that you can get from your local district wildlife biologist if you really have too many deer.
Depredation tags have to be used by a resident.
Well, you can designate somebody to use them. They have to be used outside of the hunting season. And so we want you to allow hunting to control deer. That's our first option there. But once you start having a serious deer problem, we can help you reduce your deer numbers through those depredation tags.
I just always had a question about those tags. Do you just leave the deer lay, or what happens to the dead deer?
It's a deer tag. You can take and utilize those deer if you want.
Okay.
Yep.
I heard one.
Well, years ago, you were not to utilize them. You were supposed to leave them away, but that's not the case now.
Out of curiosity, sir, on an annual basis, how much money does the department refund to non-residents that do not draw a tag?
Well, we had 24,000, I think, applications, and I'm just saying this off the top of my head, and we had just under 22,000, so we refunded about 2,000 permit fees.
Okay, so that's about $500 per permit, so it'd be, just rough math, I'm not very good, it's just rough numbers, how much is that? So if you took that, if basic economics says that money hits the economic system at a velocity of about 4. So if we took one individual that didn't get their tag and they refunded $500, and we use a money factor of 4, that means the local economy was taking up $2,000. And so if we take that across the state, in rural Kansas, with a 4 economy, we're talking probably $5-6 million out of the rural economy on an annual basis. That's tough.
Well, one point to make is we still have the same number of deer permits available in these units, even though some hunters didn't draw. So the same number of hunters are still coming here to hunt. They're still spending their money here locally. But we do have to consider resident.
Money away.
The agency would be, yeah. But if we manage wildlife strictly on the basis of economics, it would be a disaster. Because somebody said your deer were getting smaller. Well, and they're getting younger. That may mean we're harvesting too many mature bucks.
I mean, we got too many does and they're just overpopulating because, like I said, the rut used to be done about the time rifle season started. Now the breeding season is going longer. You're seeing fawns in the summer that you should not be seeing. And it's a known fact that if you overpopulate, like Texas did several years ago, deer get smaller. And I'm ashamed that when I was in Texas, I used to train dogs and go to field trials. Locals down there said, man, look at all those deer. I looked down and said, we call those fawns in Kansas. But now I'm ashamed that I'm seeing deer the same size as what those guys were bragging about in Texas.
Yeah.
And that's a population issue. That's not a shooting a buck issue.
Okay,
There's too many does.
if we're going to have discussion, let's have use the mics because Sheila can't get a hold of them. If you're going to control deer, you're going to have to do it through harvesting does. And harvesting bucks isn't going to make any real difference. And so I think one possible suggestion is to allow people who who applied and were unsuccessful in getting a buck permit, that as a non-resident, that particular denial would allow them to have an antlerless permit. And I think we should consider that as a way to maybe solve the problem with the buddy draw or something like that. But this is a complicated matter, and unfortunately, there are a lot of opinions, all of which the opinor believes he's accurate and correct. And so I understand and I appreciate the sentiment and the honesty by you people. I think we probably ought to go on and see if there's anything more that we might have to talk about. But I appreciate all of you coming forward and giving us your thoughts. Like I say, a lot of these I've heard before, and I agree with a lot of them and don't agree with every solution. There are lots of ways to get it done. Does anybody else have any topics on non-agenda items? Will you come up to the mic, please?
Adrian Johnson, West Bay, Kansas. We've got out-of-state hunters that hunt joining me. I think they've shot one doe in 6, 7 years. If they don't get a trophy buck, they go home without it. Now, that's what's hurting us. There's another neighbor, Jones, that on the other corner. I don't think they even hunted. They didn't see what they wanted. They've got a 50-bushel feeder out there for the deer. The fella that leased that ground out is going to suffer bad this next year. One of the neighbors seen 21 deer right next to him.
Okay.
That was in one evening. Say he went out 3 o'clock or a little after the dark. He already had his buck. He was just out watching. Thank you.
Any other non-agenda items? Any other discussion on? No, go ahead.
Corley again, Anderson Coffee County line, Westphalia, Kansas. Going to throw in another whole different issue. We've got one farm, quarter section, that we found a bunch of wild pig damage on. We've got a serious problem developing. And apparently this one was hauled in from somewhere, but there's 2 known wild pigs in our area. And I know Wildlife and Parks doesn't have a lot to say about that, but that is something this state does not need.
Yeah. Wildlife.
I hunt wild pigs in Oklahoma every year, and it's a lot of fun, but they destroy more deer and more of everything. We don't want those guys here.
Kansas is probably doing as good a job as any state in managing the increase of wild pigs. And one of the ways we do that is not allow any recreational hog hunting, because what happens, the same people who get bored with leasing deer property in the fall are the ones that go down and trap deer and trap hogs and bring them and release them. All of these hogs that show up are probably here because of human assistance. And
Sure,
we
that
try
is
to
true.
stop them. They think, well, we get a population started, then we can make some money by selling hunts. It's not funny, and we try to avoid it as much as possible. Kansas has done a good job, and if you have evidence of wild pigs, you let your game warden know, you let somebody know, and we'll do everything we can to minimize their growth. And that is not an easy task.
I know, I've done that, and I contacted the people, and then I was told to call the Livestock Association, of which I am a member. And they brought a trap out and caught him, and he got out of the trap.
Well,
and they're hard to see. I can see why they are such a difficult creature to control, because there was several of us in the neighborhood knew it. And as far as I know, I'm the only one that ever saw him, and that was when he went over the side of the trap.
I hope that he didn't have a couple girlfriends, because
Well,
you'll
so
know it
do
if
we.
you'll know it if that's the case. So I appreciate your
But
input.
anyway, and I'm not criticizing what's been
No,
done in the
I
past.
know, but
I just trying to emphasize, we've got a big problem on the
It's good for us to know.
And thank you.
All right. Seeing no other hands raised, I'm going to move into the department report with the agency and state status report. Brad?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. So in terms of fiscal status, we have completed submitting our fiscal year 2021 budget. Department of Budget made their budget recommendations and approved what we submitted. We haven't had the response yet. It should happen any day. I was talking with Larry Campbell, the state budget director, just the other day, and it may have been announced this morning. It's in short order. If it hasn't been announced, it will be announced, and we'll find out just where we stand. The only adjustment they made that they gave us feedback on initially was we had a supplemental in there that we were going to move law enforcement officers from Capers to Kansas Police and Firefighters Retirement. And the governor agreed to that, and that was a big step because people wanted to know, does the governor support this? And she did. But the legislature requested that we remove it from her budget because it hasn't been approved by the legislature yet. So it was a matter of timing. And so we understand once it does move through the legislature, which we're hopeful to do this session, that then it'll be added in to the budget. So we're still optimistic about that. Our EDIF apportionment for 2021 will remain the same as 2020, just over $5 million. That's spread between administration, parks, and tourism. We'll hold our budget static from fiscal year 20 to 21. The only question out there is our needs to address flooding issues. At the end of the year in December, we felt like the waters had gone down sufficiently to where we could make a projection that we really hadn't been able to make all summer and fall because the water was still so high. But at that point, trying to quantify, our best numbers were that our revenues were down about $1.3 million because of the flooding that lost services that we weren't able to provide. The big hit was on maintenance, right? We knew that the gravel, the riprap that was lost, the asphalt roads and parking areas that were inundated for so many months, we knew would suffer, and they have. So we evaluated that, and our projections over basically the next year that we would need to spend to restore those came in at about $9.7 million is our best projection. We broke that up for benefit of the governor and the legislature into 3 buckets. What we would do right now, what based on orders and long lead times for things such as docks, what it would take us 6 months or so to do, and then finally those things that we don't feel like we can get to till next summer and fall. Obviously, our priority is to have things ready for people to come back in the spring and when we get a lot of our business, and then carrying on to summer. So that's our goal. We have a plan. We feel like we have a good estimate of what it'll cost. We don't have those money. We don't have $9.7 million sitting there to spend on this. So the legislature has asked, and we've told them this is what our estimate is that we might need, and we'll wait to see just how the money comes in and what we can do first, second, and third. So that's our plan with the parks. Cabin revenue for the year finished down about 16% from the previous year. Again, that's because of flooding impacts. Right now, our revenue in December, at the very end of the year, was up a little bit. People are anxious to come back and use those facilities. Wildlife Fee Fund is up overall about 2.3% from this time last year, so that's good news. Our balance at the end of December fiscal year 20 is very similar to last year's, only off by a couple $100,000. So that consistency is good. That's where we want it to be, about $14.7 million. The last thing I'll mention is, as you're aware, we're almost entirely funded from sportsmen and women's dollars, licenses that leverage federal tax monies that are collected, again, from sportsmen and women expenditures. And so Steve Adams, who manages those federal funds for us, indicated that Pittman-Robertson funds are expected to be down about 15% next year, mainly as a result of lower sales of those outdoor items. Bingle Johnson is expected to be up about 3%. And these won't be able to be updated for some months, but those are our best numbers right now as far as projections.
The point I would make is that notwithstanding that money can't be used to fix our parks.
Correct.
It has to be
separated.
used for the purpose of the Pittman-Robinson and Dingell-Johnson Act. So
Exactly right.
while we may, there are days when it comes to our revenue, during the Obama years, there was 1 million guns sold, and we all made more money. And because there was a lot more excise tax collected. So now that we've had a change in administration, the velocity of gun purchases is down, and I think that's primarily why we're not getting as much money from PR.
Yeah, I think you're right. Are you recommending we
No.
elect another Democrat? No. I just wanted to be clear about that.
No, I am not.
Just wanted to be clear. Okay.
To be clear.
Couple other points, if I could. Today is a special day, and I appreciate Nadia reminding me of this. It's Law Enforcement Appreciation Day. We have a number of our law enforcement officers here. We have the core law enforcement group under Colonel Jason Ott sitting back there. Jason, raise your hands so everybody knows. And then we also have law enforcement in our parks and public lands. And they're a central part of our agency. They do great work. They have a tough job. And we're appreciative of them all year round, but especially today, we'd like to celebrate that. So thank you all. A couple other updates, a pretty timely one. A number of you have heard about a buck that's become famous in Osage County 2011. It was poached from a roadside and has been kind of controversial because we have a neighbor that has kind of claimed that buck should be his all these years, and there's been a lot of conversation about it. My goal, since I've come to work with this agency, has been to kind of get us past that issue. And so last night at 5 o'clock, we met that adjacent landowner who bid $16,001 for that deer head, and we gave him that deer head. He gave us a check for $16,001, and our real goal with that has been to again move on, allow our department and allow this individual to move on. So that's our hope. One of my concerns in all the dialogue around that is we have kind of lost out on a key issue here, and that is poaching. Poaching is a big problem in Kansas. It's a problem in all 105 counties. It is it's a criminal activity. It involves the wasting of wildlife, and it deprives sportswomen and sportsmen of a wonderful opportunity to chase beautiful animals. And so the money from that, that $16,001 will go into an account that will incentivize people to report under Operation Game Thief, report future poaching, right? So that money isn't going into anybody's paycheck. It's going to the public to incentivize reporting.
That's a reward fund, right?
Exactly right. Okay. Exactly right. Yeah. So that's how it's going to be used, and we hope it goes to a good cause. We hope that we can work our way past this long-standing issue and all the important things that our folks do. The last thing I'd mention, Mr. Chair, on a personal note, I have to catch a plane to be in a meeting in California tomorrow morning, so I'm going to leave, if it's all right with you, at the break, and I will, and then I will see you at the next commission meeting. But I'll be here till the break.
Okay.
Thank you.
Remember, when you're in California, you can't hunt bobcats anymore. They've been completely protected. Chris, you have 2020 legislature to discuss?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the 2020 legislature starts on Monday. It is the second year of a two-year cycle. It's also an election cycle. And there are a number of major items ongoing politically throughout the state, at the state level. like Medicaid expansion. And there was just a briefing, I think, this morning with the Senate Majority Leader. I haven't had a chance to read the press releases and things like that on a compromise. So that actually may help the session get along a little easier. And then, there's always budgetary issues, and I think that there appears to be some rift between one of the other segments of government. There's three branches of government: judiciary, executive, and legislative. And so I think that there are some other broader issues floating out there that may slow our process down. But nonetheless, we've got 5 real initiatives this year. We've got KPF, as Brad talked about, Kansas Police and Fire retirement for our law enforcement. We did get that introduced again last year, and last year it passed out of committee and then languished on the House floor and didn't make the procedural deadlines and was stricken from the calendar. And so this year we're going to reintroduce it again, likely next week or early the following week, and give it another shot. Dynamic pricing for cabins and campsites. It's an issue that's been around for now 4 years. Last year it made it 3/4 of the way through the process. It's now in House appropriations. Did not meet the deadlines, and basically when the stuff gets routed off the calendar and not routed right back on, it's an attempt by somebody, and I don't know who to stop that process. So we're going to work on that issue again. We have fee caps. As you know, many of our fees are capped in statute. You, as a commission, pass those regulations that set fees based upon recommendation of the department. Unless those fee caps increase, there will be no fee increases in the immediate near term. If you recall recent history, and I say recent, the last 20 years, the agency's had 2 fee increases, once in 2002 and once in 2015. Eventually, those caps will have to be raised in order to leverage federal dollars as well as to continue operations at the same level. So we proposed that 2 years ago, had a hearing, and last year it did not get a hearing and languished in committee. We're going to have discussions on Wednesday morning in front of that committee, and we'll talk about the various bills that we have and this one in particular. Fourth area is land acquisition. There is a piece of property that we're attempting to purchase. We're waiting on a legal description, but it adjoins Kingman Wildlife Area. 3 years ago, we introduced a bill to purchase a piece of property that Ducks Unlimited owns. It didn't really go anywhere last year. We didn't bring it back, but this year we're going to bring it back, and there's been some compromise and some discussion with folks, and essentially Ducks Unlimited is doing a swap with a neighbor, and then we'll end up with a slightly different piece of property than what we proposed 2 years ago. So that's in the works. And then there's a small little tweak to one of the statutes that deals with personal flotation devices. Dan Heskett had brought a proposal to the management team about the changing of the nomenclature of personal flotation devices, which we will see filter down into regulation, but first I need to make a change in one of the statutes. And then I think there'll be likely some likely topics. There's an anti-poaching bill, and the draft that I saw would provide restitution to landowners of half the amount of mandatory restitution for certain value of animals. I've also heard talk of other deer things, unlimited non-residents, transferables. Those things all float out there, but there's nothing definitive on that. And that's pretty much what I have. Any questions?
There was nothing pre-filed that we have an interest in by anybody.
Nothing that impacts the stuff that we normally put on the website. You know, I track roughly 120, right now I'm tracking about 120 bills. By the end of this session, I'll be tracking probably 160 or 180 bills.
Every year there's a few junk bills that surface, and I didn't know if any of those had been pre-filed.
No. So none of the bills that would impact our constituents directly that have been pre-filed. I'm not concerned with those. There is one that would impact the regulatory process, and I have some concerns about it, and I've relayed those concerns to the appropriate folks. But apart from that, nothing that our constituents would be interested in.
Our retirement plan that we tried to get through last year, is there objection by anybody to that?
I think strategically there are, we're a fee-funded agency, and so it would come out of our budget, and we've planned for that appropriately. I think there are on the landscape a couple of other issues that deal with Kansas Police and Fire retirement, KPF, and we would be another cabinet level agency that would like to be in it, but is a state general funded agency. So I think that causes some difficulty. And I think that there is also an attempt by local corrections entities to be able to enter into KP&F as well. And so I think that kind of muddies the water. I think if you just presented our issue directly face on, straight on to the legislature, it's pretty easy and clear to make those arguments, and it should pass. When you add those other things into it, it makes it more difficult.
Okay.
And to Chris's point, sometimes those other entities say, let's all combine, right? And we aren't trying to dismiss them at all, but we think it's easier for the legislature to make the decision, each of those requests on their own merits. And we certainly think, to Chris's point, that we have a strong case for representing our law enforcement folks.
Any other questions or comments?
Is the transferable deer tag, was that done? Or it was gutted last year, pretty much?
Okay, the way the process
right?
worked, that bill was introduced in the House. It passed the House by one vote, made it into the Senate. The Senate did what's called a gut and go, where they put contents of another topic into that shell bill. So that shell bill no longer existed as a deer bill. It became, I don't remember what it became.
Hemp. It was a natural hemp.
It became the hemp bill. So then it was passed and signed by the governor. So that topic is dead. If it is coming back, it's coming back in the form of a new bill.
Any other questions for Chris? Questions from the public? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, one thing I forgot to mention, I should have referenced as a part of our recovering money for the parks damages, we've quantified all those damages and are submitting those all to FEMA. It's a slow process. We've requested this months ago, but we haven't even yet gotten the FEMA representatives out to all those locations to view our areas. But we're quantifying every bit of that. We'll submit every bit of that in counties where that's an option. It takes a while. And you never get 100%. Of course, you get at most 75% and typically less than that. But we are going down that path and going to try to get everything we can via that mechanism.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on to the Commissioner Big Game permit drawing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. This is, I think, going to be the 20th time maybe we've done this. It's maybe the 15th time, I'm not sure. We just started this in 2006. And we started drawing for conservation organizations to be able to auction off a big game permit. And then that money would then be used at a mutually agreed upon conservation project. And it kind of started out slow. In 2006, we only had 59 applications. But we did, the elk permit that year went really high, so we did get the permit sold for about $49,000. Each year it's grown a little bit, and the conservation organizations have to be nonprofit organizations based or operating in Kansas that actively promote wildlife conservation and the hunting and fishing heritage. Each chapter is only eligible to win one of these permits once in a 3-year period. Again, they sell that to the highest bidder. They get to keep 15% of the proceeds. We subtract the amount of the permit out of that fee They submit that back to us. We agree upon a conservation project of some sort, then we give that money back to them to complete that conservation project. Sometimes they just, like a DU chapter may put their money back into bringing back the bottoms, or the Pheasants Forever chapter may donate their money back to one of the pheasant initiative projects. So there's a variety of different projects that they will use this money for. Some of it has been for youth recruitment programs, youth hunts, youth shooting, sports shooting events, and things like that. It's been, over the years, it's been a highly successful. As you'll see in the briefing, we've raised nearly $597,000 for conservation over the years with this. We started out, it can be 7 deer permits or 5 deer permits, an elk permit, and an antelope permit. And that's, when they apply, they make a choice. In recent years, it's been mostly deer that they've preferred, and this is an any deer permit statewide, any season with legal equipment for that season. So it's a fairly sought-after type of a permit. We still receive some applications for elk. Most of the time, that's going to be something that they'll have to go to the Fort Riley area to utilize, but it's been primarily deer over the last few years. So,
And it's the only way you can get 2 antlered permits?
correct. This does not count against any of your other permits during the year. So if you drew a tag or you bought a tag and you bought one of these, you could have 2 antlered permits in a year with one of these.
Okay.
And if there's any other questions, I will start the drawing.
Let's start the drawing.
Okay.
I'm anxious to grab a ping pong ball.
We had 210 applications this year, correct, Sheila?
Yes, 210 eligible apps.
Did any of them request elk?
Yes, some of them did.
Usually it's almost always deer.
Yeah, most of it is deer, but there are a few that did request elk as their first choice.
Okay. Emmerich?
210. What are the odds?
What are the odds,
Better go get a
right?
lottery ticket.
That is Ducks Unlimited Cheyenne Bottoms.
Yay.
Good outfit.
210. Chris is looking at you, Chris Times.
What was their?
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. Their first choice is deer.
78.
78 is Ducks Unlimited Prairie Dog Chapter.
Where's that at?
And they first choice is deer.
$166.
166 is Pheasants Forever North Fork Tail Gunners Chapter. And their first choice is deer.
198.
198 is Ducks Unlimited Topeka. First choice is deer.
107.
107.
107 is Ducks Unlimited Kiowa County Chapter. Their first choice is also deer.
$205.
205 is Ducks Unlimited St. Paul. And first choice is deer.
207.
207 is Wyandotte County Ducks Unlimited. First choice is deer.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Voting Educator of the Year Award. Dan?
Good afternoon. While I start talking, we're going to make the recipient set his own awards up because they're heavy and he's younger than I am. So, created in 2011, the National Association of State Boating Law Administrators, along with BoaterExam.com, announced the Boating Educator of the Year Award. The award is designed to recognize those in boating education field who go above and beyond to engage students and boaters, raise awareness, and make boating education and education initiatives relevant, thorough, and exciting. Nominations for this award must be submitted electronically by a boating law administrator through the members-only portion of the NASWA website. Boating law administrators should nominate candidates who have made an outstanding contribution to boating safety through education. Educators and volunteers from state and local agencies and from nonprofit organizations are eligible. 3 regional finalists will be chosen and will win a paid trip to the NASWA annual conference where the national winner will be chosen. The national winner will be announced and recognized during the award ceremony at the NASWA annual conference. According to John Johnson, NASWA Executive Director, because of the role of boating educators play in recreational boating safety, it is clear that they deserve to be recognized. With this award, NASWA will acknowledge those that are making a noticeable effort to increase boating safety awareness and reduce accident, injury, and death on the water through education. Officer Jesse Garrett was nominated by the Region 2 Law Enforcement Division as a Regional Boating Educator of the Year. Officer Garrett's nomination was reviewed and with a few additions submitted to the Western States Boating Administrators Association, where Officer Garrett was announced as a regional winner. As a regional winner, Officer Garrett was paid by NASWA to attend the annual conference held in Anchorage, Alaska, and was recognized in front of his peers as a regional winner. Officer Garrett was in very good company with the winning recipients of the northern and southern states. In the final announcement, Officer Garrett was awarded the National Award, a very prestigious award which encompasses boating educators from state, federal, and private entities across the United States and 6 territories. Congratulations, Officer Garrett, and now I'll turn it over to Captain Melson to read his nomination.
Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, the Major wrote a very good nomination. And if you know the Major very well, he wrote a very long and detailed nomination. If you would like a copy of the official nomination, send either one of us an email. We'll get a copy of it for you. I do have a much more brief one that I will read here today, though, okay? But we can get you that if you want. It's very detailed about Jesse's accomplishments to receive this award. Jesse Garrett was acknowledged for his efforts towards recreational boating safety and was selected as the Boating Educator of the Year for the Western Association of Boating Law Administrators after being selected as the department's Educator of the Year. Jesse became one of 3 finalists for the Boating Education Officer of the Year award for the National Association of Boating Law Administrators and was announced as the recipient of that award during the NASBLA Fall Conference held in Anchorage, Alaska. Lieutenant Garrett's nomination included many accomplishments towards the promoting of recreational boating safety. A few of the highlights of his nomination included the statistic of Milford Reservoir claiming 1 to 3 drownings per year, mainly Fort Riley soldiers. During the 12 years that Lieutenant Garrett worked on Milford and his efforts to incorporate boating safety classes at Fort Riley Military Base and the military's marina, there has only been 3 drownings in 12 years. Lieutenant Garrett also coordinated efforts with K-State to include the Kansas recreational boating safety class into curriculum for college credit. Lieutenant Garrett also teaches during that curriculum. Lieutenant Garrett is also sought after for his instruction, excuse me, for the department's law enforcement staff and other agencies. He teaches water safety survival, field sobriety, seated battery instruction, and is a boating education instructor. The Boating Education of the Year Award was launched by NASBLA in 2011 to recognize those who gave above and beyond to encourage students and boaters, raise awareness, and make boating education initiatives relevant and exciting. Jesse, congratulations.
Okay, congratulations.
Just a little bit. We rank about in the middle of all the states on our number of boating registered boaters in the state and about the body of waters that we have. In the last 4 years, though, we've had 2 national award winners on our Boating Educator of the Year, and we've had a regional winner for the Boating Law Enforcement Officer of the Year. So our state is very well represented on the national level, and that's something we should all take pride in. So, thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, we're going to have one more, and then we're going to take a break. Jason, would you help with the National Bob White concert? Is that Firebird?
That is the Firebird Award, yes.
Yes, there was a typo.
Oh, did I type something wrong?
Firebird.
Furbird? Furbird. All right, then.
So this is going to be the Furbird Award
Furbird.
instead.
Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. The Firebird Conservation Award was established by the National Bob White Conservation Initiative to allow state quail coordinators the opportunity to recognize an individual, a group, or an entity that has made a significant contribution to Bob White quail restoration in their state over the past year. John Johnson has been the manager at Woodson Wildlife Area since 2012. Since that time, John has implemented many quail-friendly practices and habitat improvements on the approximately 3,000-acre area. Oak savanna restoration, invasive tree removal, spring, summer, fall burning rotations, and patch burn grazing rotations. John has monitored these impacts from these grazing regimes by utilizing exclusion devices and established a contract to document and quantify plant diversity changes based upon these regimes. He's also established a fall covey count to help survey to monitor the responses in the population. John researches and obtains equipment to assist in improving efficiency and effectiveness while implementing these habitat management actions. Multiple presentations have been provided not only to department personnel, but to private landowners, noxious weed directors, and academia. This has been well received by the local ranchers and has influenced their management to adopt more quail and wildlife friendly practices. John has been able to do this by showing it actually improves the producer's bottom line. By influencing the local community, it has expanded the footprint of management beyond just the wildlife area. John is very deserving of recognition for the positive changes in landscape, habitat, and community attitudes. It's for these reasons I'm pleased to present Public Lands Manager John Johnson with the 2019 Firebird Conservation Award.
I would like to just make a couple comments as well. I have land, my cousin has land really close to the Woodson Wildlife Area. And not only has John worked tirelessly to keep the property in pristine condition, he's established a rapport with the locals to where Wildlife and Parks is also considered a good neighbor. So I can't say enough positive. So congratulations, John. So anyway, I'm going to say at this point, let's take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll get started with the walleye study.
So we have a great time.
So are you right on all the horses?
Yeah. We don't have a house on the fairway. I just want to But we're in the syndicated area.
Perfect.
I'm cooking. All right, whistle.
Oh, yeah. 150 to
Let's go.
120 yards down the fairway. You don't want to own a house.
Not when he's
Or me.
Good to stand up. It's not very big whoopee cushion.
Don't bust that deal, or it has to eat it back there.
Okay. Before we start with the walleye study, I want to have just a brief thought to throw out. And is Doug still here? Okay. And I was talking a little earlier with Dan. There has been this year, and it's stopped now because the lake got muddy, but there has been a tremendous harvest at Pomona Lake, and it's a 50-fish lake. And based on the size, the number of boats, and it's not that far from Johnson County, and it has really been hammered. And I've had a lot of local anglers contact me and want to have consideration given to making it a 20-fish limit lake. Generally, it's been my opinion that limits make you feel better than do good, but sometimes that's important too. And most of the time, the last time we had anything with this much of a harvest was in Glen Elder, and I think we went ahead and made a limit on that. Pomona it's dropped its 10-inch minimum because the feeling, I believe, and Doug, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the short fish were probably being discharged through the dam, through the spillway. But there are a certain group of people that feel like a good day means a limit, and so therefore 2 guys in a boat have to catch 100 fish, and we're talking a lot of 12-inch plus fish. So I don't know if it makes any difference. I told these people I would bring it up, and I'd like for you to talk to some local biologists and law enforcement. I don't know if we have a commercial black market fish sale going anywhere. I don't know. It probably, if he's catching a lot of fish and I'm not, why, he's probably selling them. And so who knows? But I would like to have you talk to the appropriate people and see whether or not they feel like we need to get some any traction on getting a reduced limit on Pomona.
We can do that.
All right. I have not, unless somebody else on the commission has a thought on that. The byproduct of a terrible summer of fishing has been that the water's been high, and from my amateur biology, I'm assuming that there was a lot of young of the year that grew fast, and a lot of last year 1 and year 2 grew fast because there's a ton of things to eat. And now that the water's settled back down, it seems to be good in a lot of different lakes, not just the ones that I fish. So if I have pretty good luck, that means there must be a lot of fish. So anyway,
I might just mention, Gerald, that we are in the process of putting an article in the magazine about the prospects for next year with a key look at what floods did to fishing for the past year. So we'll have that soon. Jeff Cook at Emporia is authoring that and working with Nadia to get that in the magazine. Probably be a news release with it as well. But we do have some great fishing ahead of us. The high water kept people off the lake, so some of the fish carried over. They weren't harvested. They'll be available this next year, hopefully, if water levels are good. We had tremendous reproduction in a lot of our lakes, and so it's mostly a positive story. We did lose some fish through the dam. There was no doubt that we had some flushing, but in general, I think we're poised for some fantastic fishing. And when we have fantastic fishing, we have these reports of people thinking that somebody got more than they deserve, and so I'm not surprised by the concerns that you're hearing. The good news is there's a lot of fish out there, and people are able to catch them. So it'll just be up to us to try to come up with the right strategies to make this last as long as it can. So thank you.
Okay. All right, Scott, let's talk about walleye at Glen Elder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. If you guys remember, several years ago, we introduced the Kansas Walleye Initiative at a commission meeting in Topeka. And this study is somewhat a byproduct of that initiative that we started. Part of the initiative is we altered many of our length and creel limits on our reservoirs and state fishing lakes. And at that time, I'd actually proposed kind of a new regulation at Glen Elder. It was going to be an 18-inch, 24-inch seasonal length limit. But after looking into it a little bit, I decided that my estimates of mortality on walleye Glen Elder needed to be revamped. The estimates I had were from many years ago. A lot of things had altered and changed since then. So I decided to rescind that length limit change that I had at the time. So with that in mind, I did want to get a better understanding of what was going on with the walleye population at Glen Elder. And the first thing I wanted to look at was what are the actual mortality rates. So it coincided perfectly with the folks at the Emporia Research Office, the fisheries guys there, started a new grant program for district fisheries biologists like myself that we could apply to put in for special research projects that we'd conduct on our own. And these were voluntary in addition to our regular duties. And I'd been wanting to work on telemetry because that's what I did in my graduate research project. I've been wanting to work on telemetry since I'd been here. And there's a telemetry-based mortality estimation model that works very well in these types of waters. So I was able to combine the need to look at mortality rates of walleye in Glen Elder with this new telemetry project. And you're going to see, besides getting mortality rates out of this, I'm getting a lot more information from this project. It is a 3-year project. I started it in November of 18, so this is about a third of the way through it. So I'll just kind of provide an update of what I found so far and kind of where it's going to be headed. So, like I mentioned, there's 4 objectives to the study, but the primary objective is to look at mortality rates. I want to look at the sources of mortality, when is the mortality occurring, and what's affecting the mortality. For instance, this year, the high water, you'll see that had a big effect on our mortality rates. So that is the number 1 objective. But when we're doing telemetry on fish, we're going out there and we're locating these fish. We're getting their location. We're looking at individual fish from day to day to day. So we can actually track individual fish movements. We can look at their habitat preferences, and we can just look at home ranges, all sorts of different factors that we can look at, things that we really don't have a good understanding on right now in Kansas. And I know at Glen Elder, we've never had any type of study like this done before. So like I mentioned, in addition to looking at movements and how they relate to different factors, looking at habitat preferences. So when I locate a walleye, I literally get it right on top of it in the lake. I know it's right here. What I want to be able to do is explain why is this walleye here in this spot where it's got this whole other area of lake it's not in. So try to really kind of pinpoint what the walleye are selecting for in these reservoirs. And in addition to the telemetry study that I'm conducting, I did a creel survey last year and I'm running a creel survey this year in conjunction with the telemetry. So this will help explain angler fishing patterns and harvest rates, kind of coinciding with what I'm actually seeing with my tagged fish. So I'm not going to get into too much detail in the model. That's kind of more fisheries type stuff. But basically what I want to just point out is this is kind of a capture recapture. Every time we go tracking, we have X number of fish out in the population, and we go out and we find Y number. So we'll find 90% of those fish. And between each tracking location, this helps us estimate what our mortality rates are. Between fish being caught, fish dying of natural mortality, or fish lost to flooding releases or entrainment, we get our different sources of mortality. And with this model, it's a lot more in depth than just saying our annual mortality is 70%. I can look at daily mortality rates, monthly or annual, and then look at the different causes through each of those periods. So why is there a map of Puerto Rico up here? Kind of weird talking about Kansas fish, but I did my master's research in Puerto Rico, and I worked on this reservoir, Luquetti Reservoir, studying largemouth bass, believe it or not. And this was the first time I'd been exposed to this model. So I tagged 50 fish for over a 2-year period, so 100 fish total, tracked those fish and came up with mortality estimates. That's what these numbers are. To summarize what we got out of it was I found that these largemouth were spawning 6 months out of the year. So between January and June, the fish would spawn. They'd only live to be 2 or 3 years old, then they'd die of natural mortality. So they had very high harvest restrictions at that time, and we discovered a lot of these fish were dying naturally before anybody was able to harvest them. And harvesting bass down in Puerto Rico is a lot more of a consumptive resource than it is here in the United States. So based on these findings, they were able to alter a lot of their length and creel limits and allow more harvest of largemouth. So that's kind of one example of how this works, at least down in Puerto Rico. Some other studies that have been done in the U.S., Roanoke Reservoir up in Virginia looked at mortality rates of striped bass. I actually worked on another telemetry project in North Carolina at Baden Lake. We looked at striped bass. Even out on coastal areas, the red drum, they've been studied out there. Young salmonids up in the northwest, and now applying that same model. It's basically the same model, it's the same procedure and everything. Like I said, you can apply it to different types of water bodies and impoundments. So I'm really excited that I'm able to do this here in Kansas. So when I talk about walleye habitat, most of you probably have a general idea of what we're talking about, but this is just a list of all the different variables that I'm going to be able to collect through this study. When I do locate an individual fish, I always collect the GPS location, the depth of water the fish is in, what the water temperature is, dissolved oxygen levels, and then I can go back using GIS once I map all the coordinates from the fish that I find, and I can calculate average distance from shore, which varies throughout the year. Like I mentioned before, the microspatial habitat selection, why is a fish selecting this spot? I can look at distance from the river channel, how far down lake are they or how far up lake are they? What substrates are they selecting for? And then location relative to the forage in the reservoir. Are they really just located in a spot because that's where the food is, or is there another reason they're there? What's an average home range size? Males, females, older fish, younger fish, does it vary? And then I really want to get a better idea of the spawning behavior of walleye. We all know about the time they spawn. We all know they spawn on the dam. But I think there's a lot more to it. There's probably other areas they spawn. How often does the female come into the dam to spawn? Is it just a one-time deal? Do the males spend 90% of their time on the shore? So things like that are some of the questions I want to get answered from this study. So what we are using, if you think of telemetry, most people think of holding up an antenna and tracking an animal. Even fish can be tracked with radio telemetry. But because of the depth of Glen Elder, there's a good chance if you use radio telemetry, the signals don't travel very far, so you'd have a hard time detecting the fish. So I selected ultrasonic telemetry, which is just a little bit different. You actually have a hydrophone. You have to put it in the water and listen for the fish, rotate it to which direction the signal's coming from. And eventually you can get on top of fish doing that. The bad part about ultrasonic telemetry is you also hear everybody's depth finders. You just hear all these clicking noises too. So if there's a lot of boats on the water, it's kind of hard to detect the fish. So it's nice to go out when there's not as much fishing pressure going on. So these are 36-month tags, which is, I actually brought one with me. Let you guys look at it if you want to see what one looks like. So these are 36-month tags, which I think is pretty cool. The study I did before, they were only 1-year tags. So you kind of get a 1-year window of these fish, and then you don't know what goes on after that. Some of these fish I'll be tracking for 36 months and see if the behavior patterns change year to year as the fish grow, or do they repeat the same cycles year to year. So I think that's pretty neat. They weigh 17 grams, and there's a rule that you can't put a transmitter in a fish that weighs more than 2% of the fish's body weight. So that limits me to about 1.8 pound walleye and bigger is what I can tag. I can hear them up to about 1 kilometer away. People always ask how far you can hear these things. So on a lake like Glen Elder, it's 12,500 acres, and this summer it was about 16,000. So it does take quite a bit of time to search the whole reservoir looking for all these fish. And then, like I said, these fish have individual frequencies and individual codes, so I know exactly which fish is which when I hear one. That's my real state-of-the-art surgery table. In fact, in planning the transmitters is a lot of the fun of doing this project. I really like doing these surgeries on these fish. So we're able to just do them on the boat ramp on the tailgate of a truck. It's kind of a neat process. First, we put an anesthetic in water and we knock the fish out. They get knocked out. They're just barely breathing, but they're able, obviously they're still alive, still surviving. So it makes them a lot easier to work on. We actually give them a shot of OTC, an antibiotic. We spend a lot of time when we do these surgeries. These tags cost a lot of money, so if we put a tag in the fish, we want to make sure the fish doesn't die from surgery-related mortality, so we do everything we can to help the fish survive. So that's why they get these internal antibiotics. Then they get iodine solution before we actually start the surgery. I can usually get away with about a 1-inch incision, but sometimes I'm trying to sex these fish and you got to look inside and see if it's a male or female. You may have to go about 1.5 inches, but for the most part, the incision is only about 1 inch long, which doesn't cause them too much harm. We put the tag transmitter just right inside the fish, and then just a process of getting them sewn up. Usually takes about 3 sutures to get these fish sewn up. And then we actually have super glue we use, and the super glue really does a lot too. You get the sutures, which would probably be okay, but the super glue really seals that wound shut. So this is a fish right after we got done with surgery on it. And you can obviously see where the incision was, but it's healed pretty well. And what I've seen so far on this stage, we haven't had any surgery-related mortality, so all the fish have survived. 67 so far, yeah. And then this pink tag here, obviously, if you're going to look for harvest, you want to have anglers be able to identify these fish. So these are actually $100 reward tags. That gets anglers' attention when you tell them it's a $100 reward. And I can't state for sure that we've had a 100% reporting rate, because if one hasn't been reported, I don't know about it, obviously. But from what I've heard and talked to anglers, everybody that's caught a tagged fish has turned it into me. So I think we've had pretty good reporting rates so far. And here's a fish that an angler caught 78 days after we implanted the transmitter. You can see it's pretty well healed. A couple spots where the absorbable sutures haven't quite absorbed all the way, but you can tell they're in pretty good shape, looking healthy. So the fish are basically we always say within a couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, they're resuming normal behavior. So we're able to start locating them after that. This is just a basic length frequency. I just wanted people to understand about what size fish we're working with. I mentioned 1.8 pounds was kind of the limit for the size of fish that we could tag. Glen Elder is currently an 18-inch minimum, so not every fish we tagged was legal fish. There are a few of those 17-inch fish, but I would assume by now, it's been over a year, these fish are all probably legal now. So if somebody was to catch a sublegal fish, they would automatically have to return it to the water. But what's kind of interesting, this is a typical length frequency for Glen Elder, is you get a lot of fish right here at the length limit, and they drop off pretty quickly once anglers start harvesting them. I was really excited because I don't see many bigger walleye here. I had a couple 26-inch walleyes, so I'm pretty excited to see what their behavior patterns were, if they were any different than your typical Glen Elder walleye. So here we are tracking. You can see the state of the reservoir, like all the reservoirs in the state, or most of them anyways. We were flooded. We got to about 11 feet high. That's what Glen Elder was. So it made tracking a little more difficult, just having all that extra area and aquatic vegetation to search through. But it was also pretty interesting to see where the fish would go during high water periods. So November of 18, we tagged 27 walleye. And then in April, we tagged the last 33. So we had 60 tagged total. And then anglers started returning tags, so we immediately put 7 of them back out as soon as we got some tag returns. So that's where I come up with 67 fish we've put out there so far. This isn't actually running the model. This is just your basic percentages of what's been harvested and lost so far. But 12 fish of the 67 is only 18% harvest so far. Now that's not a very high harvest rate. But you guys have heard, and we've talked about it all year, our fishing pressure was so much less this year with the flooding that our boat ramps were closed most of the year. So I think this 18% is a bare minimum of what you're going to see. I'm really excited to see this year, if we have normal water levels, what kind of harvest we're going to see on these fish. So 1 out of the 67 ceased movement. That was a natural mortality. And then there's 12 fish we haven't been able to locate in the last 7 or 8 months. And my thought is they were probably lost to migration. So all the flood releases we had this summer, we didn't lose as many fish to fish harvest as normal, but we had more lost to outflows than we normally would. I think that would be much less in a normal year as well. Fish harvest by month, about what we've seen in the past. This is November when we tagged them all the way up to this December last month. And you can see it's pretty seasonal. One fish was caught during the spawn. I like to point that out. 1 out of 60 fish was caught during the spawn. I know a lot of anglers complain about allowing fishing during the walleye spawn because of all the mortality and harvest. But for us, 1 out of 60 so far was harvested. That's a very low mortality rate from what I've seen. May is obviously the busiest month for harvest, and it started off really high with 7 fish caught. And then that's when the lake flooded and the boat ramps closed and it dropped off a lot. We just had a few fish harvested after that. And I was very surprised. We had a lot of fishing pressure in the fall, a lot of fishing pressure, but no fish were turned in the fall. So just a quick summary. We tagged 27 fish in November of 18 and 33 here in April. First fish was caught April 5th of 19. Then we re-tagged 7 fish at the end of May. And the last fish I've had turned in was way back at the end of July. And the last time I was able to track these fish was in December, so that's my latest tracking information, was early December. This is kind of a neat little graph, kind of a basic graph, but this is just the average depth of all the walleye located, what the average depth was. And they have a pattern, which anglers had told me about this pattern, and I've kind of seen it, but to be able to actually go out and collect the data on it's really interesting. So we tagged them here in November. The fish spend the winter in deeper water. This was all ice out right here, so I wasn't able, or ice on, so I wasn't able to track that time of year. But obviously they come up shallower during the spawn. Post-spawn, they move a little deeper to rest and recover from the spawn. And then they really just spent the whole summer just going shallower and shallower. Middle of August, the heat of the summer, the water temps in the mid-80s. The fish averaged about 12 feet of water. A lot of these fish were right up. And again, that could be because we had flooded conditions, and we don't always have that kind of condition, but I thought that was really cool to see these fish in this hot water up in the shallow water. Obviously, it's related to a feeding mechanism because there are a lot of shad that reside up in that shallow water. And then when I went back out the last time, you can see they've started moving down deeper again for the winter. So kind of a pattern. I think most anglers probably understand that, but it's a good reminder for anglers to understand what kind of depths these fish are occupying throughout the year when they're heading out fishing for them. So this map's going to be hard to see on this screen, but this is just the first time I went out after all 60 fish were tagged. This red star here on all these maps is just going to indicate where we tagged all the fish and where we released them. So these were all tagged, like I said. The last 33 were at the beginning of April, so this is about a month later. I gave them a month to recover before I went and tracked them. And you can see there's still fish hanging out here in the middle in deeper water. A portion of these fish just kind of stayed near the dam and near this part of the reservoir all year long. They really just didn't want to move anywhere. They just kind of stayed over here. But there's always a big concentration over here. This is clear on the west end. Again, it's so much different this last year. We had water constantly flowing in these 2 rivers, the North Fork and the South Fork. May have attracted more fish up there than normal, so we'll find out this year, hopefully, if we have a normal year. But these maps right now, I don't have them mapped on like any bottom contours. You can't see the river channel or anything like that. Eventually, I'm going to get these mapped on much better maps, which are going to show a lot more detail where these fish are actually hanging out. In July, like I said, they started moving shallower. And again, hanging out here on this west flat right here was a very popular spot all year. This Walnut Creek area and these coves here by the dam, believe it or not, at one point, half the fish in the whole population, at least my tag population, were right here in this part of the reservoir. So if anglers know that, and some do, that's a pretty good way to target them. You can catch some fish then. And then, like I said, this is the portion of the fish that just never really wants to leave. They just kind of stay here all year. So a little bit of a variety on their behaviors. And then I just pulled out a couple individual fish, nothing real special about them, but I just wanted to show. This is a 19-inch female, kind of your standard fish you'll see at Glen Elder. We tagged it here, located it close to the tagging site a couple times, and then by summer, it took up residence here on this west end and stayed there pretty much all summer long. There's a male, kind of did the same thing. And then this one I wanted to point out, this is one of my bigger females, and there may be a reason this fish is bigger than the others, I don't know, but I tagged it in April, located it right here at the causeway on May 1st, and then for 4.5 months, we searched and searched, and we never found that fish. It just disappeared. And then September 23rd, all of a sudden, there it was again. And I was pretty surprised. After a while, you start just assuming these fish are gone, but you keep looking for them anyways. But being right here by the river channel, you can kind of guess this fish probably went way up here, the river somewhere, farther than we were looking for him, which I think is really cool. And that may be some kind of a survival tool too. This fish is probably 7-8-year-old fish, and if it's been in its summers up here in the river, it's probably not going to get harvested like the ones down here in the lake. So we'll see if that continues, but I thought that was a pretty neat finding to have a big fish like that just disappear up there. So future direction, I track these monthly in the winter, but we try to go every other week in the summer and spring when there's more activity going on. I'm going to retag about 11 fish in April to try to get my sample size back up close to 60 again. Do a lot more tracking during the spawning period like I mentioned earlier. I want to collect more on oxygen profiles. There's so much oxygen, dissolved oxygen variability in our reservoirs. I want to see if there's certain areas that they're concentrated to because of the higher oxygen levels that maybe the rest of the lake doesn't have. And I didn't mention this, but we did do some 24-hour trackings. We randomly select 4 or 5 fish, and we locate them every 2 hours over a 24-hour period, so we get daily movements, see what a walleye does throughout the day. I want to do more of that this year as well. Improve our mapping on these things, and also look at more home range determinations. I haven't done any of that yet, so there's a lot more to be done. And I presented this at our meeting, our division meeting. I said other ideas, and I had a lot of good ideas from some of the other biologists too. So lots of directions I can go with this study. Like I said, I got 2 more years with it, so I'm pretty excited about it, see where it's headed. So do we have any questions on that?
Any questions for Scott?
Scott, maybe you mentioned this, but don't you have some help with this?
Yeah.
Don't you have people?
Yeah, I have a lot of help tracking. It takes a while.
And you get, is it grad students or how do you, what kind of?
They're seasonal undergrad students helping me out. Yeah.
It's a big effort.
Yeah, it is. I turn it over to them in the summer and resume it in the winter myself. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Charlie Black, Kansas Wildlife. So if this turns out to be, revealing on all the habits of the fish, is it something that you're going to implicate at other lakes? Would that be the plan, or is it?
It's up to the individual biologist, but I think a lot of the mortality rates and information I get from this reservoir I can apply to other reservoirs too with similar conditions, which a lot of them have.
With any species?
Well, with walleye at least, yeah. That'll be an excuse for me to do another species later, which, like I said, I like doing this, so I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? All right. Matt, you back there somewhere?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I'm here to discuss the use of lights, night vision, and thermal imaging in night hunting, and this is the regulations that would be applicable to this discussion are at the top of the briefing book. Item 115.5.1 is fur bearers and coyotes, legal equipment, taking methods, and general provision. And the part of the regulation that's provided there basically allows the use of scopes that do not project light or amplify light in current coyote and fur bear hunting activities. There are no shooting hours on that apply to coyotes and fur bearers, and so you could currently use scoped equipment at night. You can hunt at night, but you can't use the lights and thermal imaging equipment or night vision, and so of course that's what brings me here today. Both the department and the commission have received numerous requests and inquiries over several years about the use of lights, night vision, and thermal imaging equipment for hunting predators, and specifically the interest has primarily been about coyotes at night. And at the last commission meeting, there was a request for clarification on the use of thermal imaging equipment for coyote by individuals who have an animal damage control permit. And so after that request for information, the commission asked me to come back here and or asked the department to present on this subject today. And so we have met internally, the department has, and discussed this, and what we provided today is a list of items for public input and for guidance from the commission. And so that's what the series of bullet points are in the briefing book item. And I'm going to go through those real quick here. First of all, a significant initial consideration may be whether the objective of allowing this equipment is to provide additional recreational opportunity, or whether it is to provide some type of population or damage control for coyotes. And a lot of our discussion at past meetings, as well as a lot of requests from the public, have cited the need to allow this equipment to better control damage from coyotes. And if that is the motive for wanting to allow this equipment, you should be aware that the animal damage control permittees can already use this equipment if they're licensed and they're dealing with cases of damage. And so in reference to the individual at the last commission meeting, the answer to his question is yes, he has an NADC permit. He can currently use night vision or lights, the types of equipment we're talking about today. Landowners and tenants or property owners can also already use this equipment as per a state law that broadly allows landowners and legal occupants to protect their property from wildlife damage. And the bullet point at the very bottom of the page there where it says recreational spotlighting, actually it says that you can't recreationally spotlight while in possession of guns or equipment, or weapons I should say, but it specifically makes an exemption to the state law KSA 32-1002 that allows landowners the ability to protect their property. So in general, if a person has damage, there are legal avenues right now for them to be able to use this equipment. Some have also suggested that this equipment could be effective at controlling coyote populations, so not related to private property damage, but just to bring the coyote population down. I provided a handout to the commission, and there's a few of these back there in the back of the room as well. The current coyote harvest over the last 10 years has averaged about 100,000 per year, and it is a slightly increasing trend over time. I've got 24 years worth of data here that's primarily gathered from the Small Game Harvest Survey. In Figure 2, it also shows that the population has increased over that time by 2, 3, possibly even fourfold. We've had a lot of things go on during that time that have been beneficial to coyotes, one of which is the implementation of the CRP program. So this figure and our roadside survey began with coyotes the year after CRP was first put on the ground in this state. So although there are some other questions about how precisely this reflects the population, it's safe to say that the population has increased despite an annual harvest of over 90,000 and more recently 100,000 per year on average. So the question then is how many coyotes would have to be harvested by the ability to use lights to actually stabilize or to control the population? We don't know the answer to that, but it seems very unlikely considering the fact that what is already allowed to kill coyotes, you can already trap them, hunt them with dogs, predator call them, year-round hunting. You can already hunt them at night without light. You can chase them around in vehicles. So there are all these other techniques that are already established. It's unlikely that the addition of night hunting of these lights is probably going to increase the harvest of coyotes by more than a couple percent. So we really don't think that this is probably going to be a significant factor in population control either. Where we do think the potential value lies is, and this is what most of the inquiries have really been about, even though they might talk about damage or population control, what they really want is to do this as a recreational opportunity. And so that's really where we think that whether or not to allow this activity, we should consider it and weigh the pros and cons of it relative to its value as a recreational activity. And one of the things, if we're going to consider it as a recreational activity that needs to be taken into account or given consideration, is whether or not it's fair chase. And this might have been evident to some of you at the last commission meeting when the individual talked about using thermal imaging and you just walk out amongst the cows and shoot the coyotes. Anybody who's hunted coyotes during the daylight would have to think that that is a pretty significant advantage. And so, and really maybe the question is it fair, Chase, to employ multi-$1,000 technology that provides you a significant advantage, an advantage that significantly outweighs wildlife's ability to naturally detect and avoid predators? And so that is a question that needs consideration. And the answer may differ by the different types of lights you might be considering. And so that brings us down to the next bullet point of what equipment should be legal. Again, the things that there are an interest in are red lights, spotlights, night vision, thermal imaging. We could also ask the question of how should this equipment be able to be employed? For example, should it be gun mounted, vehicle mounted? And then you can also talk about the weapons themselves. Should we allow shotgun only? Should there be caliber restrictions for rifle, or perhaps even a differentiation of legality based on whether the rifle is rimfire or centerfire? We also need to give further consideration to what species this may be allowed for. Most of the emphasis so far has been for coyotes, but obviously if you're out there trying to sound like a dying rabbit at night, you're not just going to call in coyotes. There's various fur bearer species that might come in as well. And so we might have an interest in allowing some fur bearers or perhaps all fur bearers in addition to just coyotes. Let's see. You could also, some states also restrict this to private land use only. And so there might be some consideration to given to whether or not we would want to allow this on public lands. And then also roadways are another sensitive area that perhaps we may or may not want to offer them from road or allow it from roads or road right-of-ways. Hunt methods are another consideration. Should you be able to do this from a vehicle or on foot only? Perhaps there should be some specified distance from a vehicle or, again, a roadway. And then also some states differentiate how you can do this as far as whether you have to be stationary calling versus some type of a mobile shining. And so that would be something to think about. We've also given consideration to various season dates. Of course, coyote season is currently open year-round. A lot of people have expressed concern about allowing this during any deer season. Perhaps a compromise might be to allow it after the firearms deer season. So, for example, a January 1 opener and then end at March 31, which would be just before the whelping season for coyotes. Some states restrict who can hunt with. If they allow it on private land only, then they might restrict hunting to landowners or their guests or perhaps those with written permission. Another consideration here is that the only people who would be able to do this would have to have some type of a special permit. And interestingly, a lot of the people who have came forward that I've talked to who've tried to get us to allow this have said, well, you ought to establish a night hunting permit in addition to a hunting permit. So sometimes some people have actually asked for that. It would be a way to keep track of how many people are doing it. There are a series of special restrictions that could be considered, for example, that would also allow us to better monitor who's doing this. One would be requiring an electronic check-in like we currently do with public land, so kind of an iSportsman type of thing. At least one state, I believe, requires these individuals to check in with the local sheriff's department, and in some cases, written permission of the landowner may be required. And then near the bottom, poaching enforcement concerns have been the major thing that has held the department back on this issue, and this is the reason that our field law enforcement staff are generally strongly opposed to the department providing this opportunity or allowing for this opportunity. And so, of course, we would like to have those issues be given further consideration. I provided a list of other state regulations on page 2 there, and that was just some of the Midwest regulations. So you can see the diversity of things other states have done to try to make this palatable. And with that, I'll turn this back over to the commission.
Does a landowner now controlling damage to cattle or whatnot, does the landowner now need to have a special license, one of these
No,
control license?
No, the state law that allows them to protect their property doesn't require any special license or anything like that. It does say they can't keep the wildlife that they kill. So,
have you visited with any of the other states that allow this, and do you have some sense of what kind of issues that they have experienced?
my counterparts, the fur bearer biologists of the Midwest, have not had issues with it. I know Jason and law enforcement may have a little bit different perspective. I know he had mentioned an issue or two from Texas, I think, but it generally, I don't know. I don't know that it winds up getting used maybe as widely as what you would suspect.
Is there a safety issue? And let me give you a personal anecdote. We raise cattle, and quite a few cattle, and we have quite a few coyotes, and we have only one documented coyote death. So I'm not that concerned about the coyote population. But if you allow hunting at night, even if I don't allow it on my own land, and the neighbors do, and we're out when you're calving, you're out at night, is there an issue with safety and errant shot, or that would be a concern of mine.
Yeah, those types of incidents are really rare as far as I can gather.
One hurts pretty bad, though.
Sure. You can say the same thing about daytime coyote hunting as well, or somebody hunting at dawn or dusk, or somebody hunting at night without a light, which they can currently legally do. So the safety concerns that some people have expressed, I don't believe are an issue in these other states. They have not had very many incidents, or hardly any incidents. I mean, it's just as safe as any other hunting type, to my knowledge, as any other type of hunting that's currently allowed.
Do they have any more incidents of just people hunting on land that they're not supposed to be on?
Not that I've heard, but to the extent of it being, how it's tracked precisely by state is probably pretty variable. How precisely it's being tracked.
I would think one that would have a tendency to be someplace they don't belong would have more of a tendency at night to be someplace they don't belong.
I could argue almost any side to most of these points, but you could say the same thing about coon hunters, or again, back to the coyote hunter who already can legally hunt at night on a certain night. So these are, those are concerns we've heard about, and they're possible, but it doesn't seem like they're not being reported, or they're not such an incident, so common in these other states that these other states are curtailing this activity. It's persisting in these other states, and it has, like in Nebraska, for a long time. If they were, routinely having safety issues or trespassing issues associated with it, it seems logical that that my counterpart there would have expressed those concerns. And
how big is the demand? I mean, there's how
the expense and everything.
Yeah.
Participation rate.
The demand is growing exponentially.
Yeah.
Even though it costs several $1,000s, the comments, the pressure, the requests are getting more frequent and louder. And I'm the one that partly asked to have this brought up, because one of my concerns is if we don't pass this, I've been told that a certain legislator is going to introduce this. I have been contacted asking if we're making progress, and I've said, yes, we are making progress. And this and this particular legislator is not our friend. So
what's his motivation?
What's
his interest?
It's hard to explain.
Simply commercial, right? Revenue?
Probably commercial, And I want to look at this from a recreational perspective. Myself, that's where I'm coming up. If we don't do it on our terms, it'll probably be done anyway. And it'll be done on terms that we may not be able to deal with. We won't be able to manage all the details. I guess if in a perfect world, what I would like to do is have night vision and thermal imaging, which I think are the two primary types of new equipment that we currently try to not include, and have them being a lawful method of take. I would probably also, just because, I would probably not have this lawful during the primary deer season, the 10 days or whatever it is from the first Wednesday after Thanksgiving. And I would probably include all fur bearers during their appropriate seasons, which would mean coyotes all year, which would mean fur bearers during the fur bearer season. I'm afraid if we try to start having a lot of restrictions on the front end, we're going to get bogged down in the restrictions, and we're probably going to have impatience from the legislature. And I would like to have it passed, and then as we have incidences and unintended consequences, then we can try to deal with them as they come up. I don't have this particular type of equipment, and based on the cost, I'm not sure I'm going to get it either. But I don't know if it creates an additional safety factor. Now, there is one other thing that I want, and I've talked to Chris about it. One constituent has contacted me, and maybe others, and he wants to be technical and says that project no visible light towards the target. Well, thermal imaging is permitted if you took the narrow definition of that part that we put in our publication. I don't know if the intent of the statute or the regulation was to prevent this type of activity. I don't know whether he has found a loophole, and he happens to sell these products, so he has a vested interest, although he is courteous in his dealings with me. Chris says no. I'm pretty sure that the intent is not there, and I know that's the opinion of law enforcement, and that's the opinion I always had. So the way I would do it is to have it lawful while we have some control, and then we can begin to tweak it as it comes up. Now, Warren, that may not be what you are more comfortable with.
Well, I'd like to have more discussion, and I'd like to hear from the enforcement guys and get their sense of what kind of issues we'd be dealing with. And right now, it's personal to me, because I can just imagine the problems. The only thing that's ever been shot with a spotlight on my ranch are my cows. So having more people out there with spotlights doesn't really excite me. But I'm interested in the input from the public and from the department. I think it needs more study. I hate the idea that we might be getting railroaded.
Well,
I just am willing to hear more information.
The response I had when I was asked where we were is that since we're not elected, it takes us a long time. And we have to have it workshopped twice, so we're looking at 4 months before we can begin to vote on. Is that about right, Chris? Maybe 6 months?
We'd be a ways out from a vote.
And That's the reason I hate to discuss it more. We're going to have Chris or Brad are going to be down at the State House arguing this. So just because we may be railroaded doesn't mean we have to go along with it. We still have probably 6 months of discussion before it gets passed. And I'm not in, I guess, naivete, I'm not including spotlighting as a lawful means to take either. I mean, I look at a spotlight as something you plug into the pickup, stick out the window, and I'm strictly looking at night vision and infrared as those are the two things that more people have wanted to do. And I view somebody who's going to spend $3,000 or $4,000 on some equipment plus gun may not want to take a chance on law enforcement seizing that property. And if we ask law enforcement, and I agree with them respectfully, you're going to have a little more opportunity, which is why you've been hesitant. Because if somebody's out there at night, it makes it harder for them to deal with. But I think it's coming no matter what. I think it's coming in the same way that when we dealt with crossbows and how terrible they were, if we didn't deal with crossbows ourselves, we were going to have crossbows. And if we don't deal with this type of hunting, we're going to have it anyway. Brad?
So, of course, it's important to understand what we think the demand will be, and certainly there's an exponential increase in the discussion. Matt, from your surveys with other states who've had this for some years, is it your sense that it increases initially and then flattens off, or do you have numbers that they see a continual increase in participation?
I don't know of any of them that differentiate when they do their surveys or that they survey how many people are out there doing that. I do know it is the most common request with my fur bear harvest survey every year. And so there are a lot of people in Kansas that are asking for it amongst our own fur harvesters. Okay. But I can't tell you what it is and how persistent it has been in other states. I don't know that.
Would those data be available, do you think?
Some of them, I recall talking to some of them who have said they don't differentiate in their surveys. So I know it's not in some states. Whether anybody's collecting it, I'd have to check, and I can do that.
Okay. Just wonder if this is something that's going to, get, because of the expense or the specialty of it, if there's a small community of folks interested in this, and it'll never expand beyond that. That's what I don't know.
I think that I'd like to hear more about potential demand. I guess I'd like to hear more about the fair chase aspect of thermal imaging, and then I would like to hear from our law enforcement guys, because that might add another 12 hours to your day if you're out at night too. So it is a burden in some fashion. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Jason or Bob, do you have thoughts on it?
We've, like I said, Matt said, we had a big meeting together internally, and of course I participated in that. I've polled my command staff and through them, and our opinion of it stays about the same. One of the concerns that we've got is resources, and there's not a lot of game wardens statewide. And so if there's a gunshot coupled with a spotlighting call, that probably means a game warden needs to go try to find that. We legalize another version of that in some way, shape, or form, then is that something that we can justify going out, even though we don't know if we may go out and pursue them and check them, and if they're coyote hunting, they're fine, but if they've got a trophy buck in the back, then there's a problem. And so, our concern comes to the resources that we have and the conservation of the animals themselves that aren't, the pursued, the actual pursuit that we're going after, whether it be coyotes or fur bearers or whatever we legalize. Now, like I said before, we'll work within whatever regulations or whatever we do as an agency. Those are some of the concerns that we have on the top. The conservation of the actual species and the protection of whether it be fur bears, fair chase, All these things are in safety, are all concerns. It's all legitimate conversations and stuff that we agree with what Matt's saying. I was a part of creating this list. So, we'll do whatever research you want us to do. I can come up with some other things. I've talked to counterparts in other states. No, I don't think there's been a lot of big problems come out of a lot of this, but there has been some pretty significant things reported to me as well. In Texas, I know they had some areas where people were shooting cattle and then leaving them lay and then come back and hunt coyotes around them and stuff like that. Extreme, yes. Would it happen here? Maybe, maybe not. But those are things that if, we've got a lot of stuff going on, we may have to answer to at some point.
I have talked to some of the people who have contacted me, and I've told them about law enforcement's reluctance, to which I understand. And they came back with an almost identical argument to this gentleman who says, give him your car keys, because if you're going to create a real cause on something that might do, these guys say, why should we suffer because of poachers who probably are going to poach anyway?
Very, very true.
And so that's where I'm coming from. I don't know if it's particularly fair, Chase, but I know that our own statistics, in given to the hands of unfriendly legislators, are going to say, by your own admission, coyotes are going up. Why, we need to do something about this. And this is a way that's good for Kansas economy. It's good for rural America. And that's what's going to happen.
It's good for optics salesmen.
Is the technology such that you can distinguish what you're shooting?
So it depends on the technology. There's several different generations of night vision, and remember, night vision has to have ambient light to work. Right. And so a lot of times there's an infrared illuminator that's attached to that scope or to that project that actually produces light for you if there's not enough ambient light. As the generations get newer, as the technology gets better, yeah, they're pretty good, but they're limited by ambient light and the range of your projector if you're actually using an infrared projector. Thermal technology, it's outstanding. It really is pretty good. Even in broad daylight, I was picking sparrows out of the trees, at 7,500 yards away. So it's pretty good. One of the issues that we see with that, and I think I mentioned it in Wichita here last year one time, is right now if I'm sitting on the ground calling coyotes, and I'm a pretty avid coyote caller, so I do it a lot. I'm scanning with my binoculars, and I'm looking for whatever I'm looking for. And, if a guy goes out and spends $4,000 or $5,000 or whatever $1,000 on a thermal scope or a night vision, is he also going to buy the binoculars to go with it so he can scan, or is he scanning through a scope? And if he's doing that, is he pointing his rifle at things that he may or may not want to shoot? And like you brought up earlier, the safety issue of knowing your backstop and what's beyond, is it better, worse? It's going to depend on the situation. It's going to depend on where you're at, but it does create another hurdle in the conversation. So.
I'm concerned. We asked lots of questions about the safety issues, and I have a lot of concerns there. But also the fair chase piece, we don't ask near as many questions there about the ethical basis of this. And I am concerned about the idea of acting on regulations out of fear of the legislature. I don't think that's what we're mandated to do. We need to work wisely. We need to cooperate. But to say something is going to come anyway, so therefore we need to do it our way, without considering the fair chase, the ethical basis, what we are instilling in people. If we don't teach fair chase, if we don't encourage fair chase, if we don't encourage that aspect of conservation, we are not building a generation that will continue that in the future. We will continue to treat our resources as commodities, not as resources. We will use them for financial gain instead of seeing them for the inherent value they have. I think fair chase is very important in considering this, and that we need to not just look at economics and safety, that there are some intangible things that need to be considered.
I suspect every participant would make a strong argument that it's fair chase.
I got several things. The first thing is this type of hunting is legal today in Kansas with the appropriate permits. You got to go to the extension office, take a test, it's open book, go to your local wildlife and parks agent. He'll issue you a nuisance damage control permit, and you can go to night hunting. So it is legal. So the one thing we could do is just do nothing. The answer to the legislature is there's already a law in place to go hunting. Guys are doing this. We have all the laws in place in Kansas right now to whether we can shoot off the road, whether you have permission or don't have permission to hunt. So we have all those laws in place. We don't need to change, whether we're hunting off the road. It's all in place.
But that wouldn't solve the issue of demand for recreational opportunity, because we're not going to say, okay, without question, everybody can go get an animal damage control permit.
Right. The other thing is you could, change the animal control permit to a special permit of some sort. Or you could do just like you said, Gerald, change legal equipment, change it in the book, and just move down the road.
That's the
Just change legal equipment to night vision or thermal and move down the road. I got the opportunity to go hunting with thermal, and I was using a $7,000 optic. And I'm here to tell you, it's not that easy. It's not shooting barrels. It's not shooting fish in a barrel. It is not that easy. Coyotes move. They wind you. They move around you just at nighttime, just like they do the daytime. It is not that simple. The only issue I have with just changing legal equipment is Jason, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. There's a huge difference between a $7,000 thermal and a $700 thermal.
Absolutely. You get what you pay for.
It's huge. It's a big difference in the quality of the optics and what you're really seeing. That's kind of the only real issue I have. I don't think you make this into a big public hunting issue where everybody has access to be able to do this. But
I agree with exactly what you're saying and making it a lawful means of hunting. I just would, out of respect to you and your people, I at a minimum would say not during firearms deer season, the primary firearms deer season.
I agree with that. I think the economic impact of Kansas is nothing. I looked at every person that had a nuisance control permit, and I don't know, 10, 15 people shooting coyotes? 10 or 15 people? There's lots of people that have permits, but most of it has something to do with pest control. It's not night vision coyote hunting, I don't believe. Do we agree with that?
Jason will speak to that. In total, with the nuisance animal damage control, we have about 250, 260 permits issued annually. That's gone up considerably since folks did realize that you could use the thermal and infrared optics for taking coyotes. And when we go through, there's nothing, we don't specifically ask that question. They are, if they're going to use that type of equipment, supposed to ask to have it included on the permit itself. But we estimate that approximately 35% of those total 250 permits were people who were intending to use it just for coyotes.
About 70 people.
Yep.
And you've had an influx since the Scott City meeting. The boys that came and did their little presentation, they've all got, they had no idea when they showed up at Scott City that they could do that. And those guys are tickled today. They're all happy. They all took their tests, and they're all hunting in Kansas now, and they're all good.
Yeah, the main difference is it does still have to be for damage control purposes. It can't be for recreation.
Right.
What I'd like to do is I would like to suggest that a regulation be proposed, and we're either going to vote it down or we're not. and just try to do the best you can. And that will give us 4 or 5 months yet to gather information, to do what we have to do. And I understand the feeling about you don't like to do it because you're going to be pushed into it, and we can maybe be successful and buy time and avoid that. But I think without that, I just don't see where, I'm not sure I see as much downside risk as what I'd like to have more people get involved in hunting in the state of Kansas. So, Warren, what do you think? You have
I'd like to see more people hunt, just not at night. I just don't like the idea of a lot of traffic at night. But that aside, I still need to hear more. If these people can get a license now, and I know it's for damage control, and if we're getting the demand from people that can get that license, but they don't have a client, so they just want to be, I assume that if they have a license for damage control, they have to have customers and people or their own land, which they can hunt on anyway.
They
right?
probably just go ask permission, can I hunt coyotes at night with my new equipment?
Yeah.
And everybody says, sure, hunt coyotes, we got too many of them. Or kill them with cows, even though they probably don't kill as many there.
They don't.
But I think having the animal damage control permits is kind of a funky way to deal with this. And I think what you're going to do is have everybody get one, and then you've lost control of how many people are actually doing something that the permit says for them to do.
Okay, well then I'm back to the same issues, the fair chase issue, the enforcement issue and the demand of the department. When you got more hunters, I realize poachers are going to be out there anyway. They're already out there at night, but you're going to have lawful hunters out there, and you might have mistaken. I mean, I still don't understand the technology well enough to know whether a calf can look like a coyote at any position in the night or with a cheaper lens or whatever. So there's some safety issues I need to understand a little better too.
What I'm going to recommend is that Matt and whoever he chooses, the secretary, legal counsel, whoever, try to come up with something that we can either vote yes or no on in a few months. And in the meantime, as it comes up, we'll have plenty of opportunity to debate the very issues that Warren and others have made. Whether it's fair chase, whether or not we need to do it. Maybe we'll get a better feel as to what the legislature may be thinking. There may be somebody drop a hint down there. Maybe we'll know a little more. This is not that it's going to be done, but we need to have something to vote yes or no. I get the impression from Matt that while he may not have a strong opinion either way, you don't see any deleterious issues to it.
The law enforcement issues are definitely legitimate when they're potentially getting called out to a gunshot, and now they know what they no longer have the likelihood that this gunshot was illegal or that whatever this person was doing out there was illegal. They probably have a pretty good chance right now, if it's a dark night and somebody's shooting a high-powered rifle, that it's that it's worth checking out. And so there's really no way around that. And but I'm sort of speaking for them, I guess. So,
Gerald, do you think this is just as simple as changing legal methods?
Well, I do.
Equipment.
I do. And I think it eliminates all the never-ending discussion on what little micro sentences we add into it. And then I think we let our experience in the field determine whether or not we need to reverse ourselves. We're a lot stronger position to reverse ourselves if we say, you know, our poaching calls have gone up, or these things have happened, or we've had livestock damage. It isn't going to take much of the livestock damage pinned to this to where this becomes an unpopular topic again. And I would just change the method of take and limit regular firearms deer season.
I agree. I think we have the laws in place to, daytime laws apply to nighttime laws, and you just change the method.
And if you want to shoot a bobcat and it's fur harvester season or fur bearer season, you can shoot a bobcat.
Yeah, appreciate the discussion. It's certainly our intent to be clear and to not have to have our customers work around the edges, right? We want to be clear. And with the idea that we would just change the method of take, we, with the folks we have at our avail, have the ability to evaluate that and anticipate in a thoughtful way what the ramifications of that might be, right? To the point that's been made a couple times, this will never be perfect, but we want to move forward in a considered way, and this gives us plenty to work on. Frankly, Chris wrote a note to me about timing. What's your sense, Chris?
Well, if based on the date today and things, I think the earliest you'd be voting on this is June, which gives at least 2 more commission meetings to discuss.
And the person who contacted me, I said at best it'd be next fall's hunting season, but when it would be lawful.
Right. So we would workshop this again in March, workshop this again in April. If people are interested, try to encourage them to come and discuss the issue and raise the issues, and then potentially vote in a June fashion.
And use the website to the extent we can to get public comment.
Right. Amen. We definitely want to invite that.
Either way.
And right, there's people with experience out there. We'll continue to use resources from other states who have years of experience with this. So yeah, that'll make a better decision on our part and a better rounded conversation when we get together.
Any other commissioner have any questions or any comments?
Mr. Chairman, I just, I've listened to this a long time. My grandparents were in the cattle business. My dad was. My brothers are. The only cattle we ever had shot were shot from the road at night. And you probably know it wasn't with a telescope on there. It was with an iron-sighted .22 rifle or something. I did a lot of coyote calling after night on that property with a telescope and a handheld call with a spotlight. And you definitely knew when the coyotes were there in your scope, and that was just a normal Leopold scope. So this new technology, which I've seen them using in Texas, probably you wouldn't hear the shot anymore because most of those rifles have suppressors on them. But I can't see that we're doing anything that's going to be detrimental because of, at least three of my brother's calves have been killed this year with coyotes. And so I don't see the problem. And like I think we were talking, that if we don't do it, one of those nasty legislators that I used to be are going to do something that we don't like, and we'll have to come back and fight that.
Mr. Chair, one point of clarification. A couple of people have commented on the idea of enabling this outside of the early rifle deer season. Is that kind of a consensus among you all that makes sense to avoid that? Why?
You mean the primary, the
right, primary rifle season?
I just felt that during that particular time, the game wardens are just snowed under. And I just thought it gives some bit of relief.
No, I actually think it should be illegal to be doing that during deer season.
But that's the one restriction that I would oppose.
I just wanted to clarify that. That's not saying that you all agree with the idea that we move forward with this, but we all agree that that's something we should avoid.
I would avoid that, if not even more.
Okay.
And leave it from mid-January to early summer, something like that, where there's trying to keep honest people honest. That's all you're doing.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Any other discussion? Well, then let's move on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Good discussion.
All right. Jake, importation, possession of certain wildlife.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. As you'll recall, we were contacted, and I believe each of you received some correspondence from a resident of Lawrence regarding asking us to review monk parakeets on the prohibited species list. They were a popular pet in the pet trade, especially in the 1950s, 1960s. And there are some states that do still allow them as far as possession, and that was the request that came in, was that we review this because they would like to have one as a pet. So after conducting that review, it's basically the communal nest building behavior of the birds that make them such a nuisance and allows them to really survive in climates that are much colder than that of their native Argentina. These communal nests can have anywhere from 30 to 40 pairs of birds and weigh upwards of 400 pounds. They're built out of sticks. They're the only parrot that builds nests from sticks. The rest of them use cavities. The impact from that, originally there were some concerns regarding potentials for crop damage from the birds. There is an issue with that in Argentina, but the feral populations that have established in about 12 states in the U.S. Have not been an issue for that. They adapt to, in the wintertime, basically, they're primarily in cities. Some of that may be due to the high population there and higher incidences of pet releases, but they will change their feeding habits in the wintertime and basically use people's bird feeders. So they eat seeds and fruits, so they're very adaptable birds. In those 12 states that do have established feral populations, the populations, especially down in Florida, where it's a little more mild climate, have been increasing exponentially. The population down there is now estimated to be at over 500,000 birds at least. And they spend millions of dollars annually in those states, utility companies do, in nest removals. A lot of where they build these are around transformers or on transmission lines. So with that information known, we would say at this point it's not appropriate to remove the species from the list. So we are not recommending any changes to this regulation at this time.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Jake on this? Public, commission? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Tom?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, and welcome, public. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service annually develops the frameworks for which states are able to establish migratory game bird hunting seasons. These frameworks establish maximum bag and possession limits, season lengths, and the earliest and latest closing dates. States must operate within these frameworks when establishing state-specific migratory game bird seasons. A briefing item was prepared in the Commission packet regarding development of the 2020-2021 waterfowl seasons. Included are the anticipated U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service season frameworks and pertinent background information. Notable changes from previous years in duck season closing date of January 31st, where it was previously the last Sunday of January, and the 2 additional hunting days for our veterans and active militaries. Staff recommendations and results from the recent hunter surveys will be presented at the March Commission meeting. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
There's no reason we shouldn't expect the liberal framework based on what you know.
They will have, again, be in the liberal framework. So only changes would be, again, that January 31st closure and the veterans and active military days.
Any questions for Tom?
What are you going to do? There's a question in here about shooting specs. Is it going to be the 88-day season?
Our sitting for the past 5 years or so since we've gone with option B, the later season dates with the 2-bird limit.
And that's what your proposal is?
Our staff recommendations will be in March, but more than likely, I don't see any reason to change from what we previously had.
I was contacted by somebody today that liked that proposal, the more days.
The more days.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you make the recommendation in March. You want to go on to the workshop of the duck hunting zones?
Yes, since they're integrally related, I'll go ahead and move into that. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife considers states' requests to change their duck hunting zone boundaries every 5 years. The next opportunity for Kansas to alter its duck hunting zones will be for the 2021-2022 seasons. Wherever any changes must be submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service by May 1st of 2020. Zoning is simply the establishment of independent seasons in 2 or more areas within a state for the purpose of providing equitable distribution of a harvest opportunity. Zoning enhances the state's ability to match season dates with available hunting types, migration chronology, and season preferences of duck hunters for those specific areas. The briefing item lists the U.S. Fish and Wildlife guidelines and zone options. Of particular note are the zone changes are only applied to Kansas' low plains zones, so the high plains unit boundary is not part of this process. The zones do have to be contiguous, and zone split configurations must conform to one of the 4 options listed in the briefing item. Since 1972, Kansas waterfowl seasons have contained either a zone or a split, with the low plains being created in 1996 and the southeast zone in 2011. As zones and splits are part of a preferences of hunter preference, KDWP&T strongly integrates hunters' feedback in the decision-making process. We held 6 public meetings in early August to garner waterfowl input and are finishing up a large-scale statewide waterfowl survey. Although zone and boundaries are in place for 5 years, dates and bag limits can be adjusted annually. If no changes are adopted to the zones, we will continue to have the same zone boundaries as we've had for the 2016 through the 2020 season. With that, I'll stand for any questions.
Okay, any questions for Tom?
Just out of curiosity, the early zone, why is that such an irregular shape? What's the purpose?
That's part of the contiguous zone boundary requirement, so we try to match migration patterns, mostly habitat types, migration patterns, and hunter preferences. So that long continuous stretch is kind of connecting Jamestown down to some of the playas around Dodge City, Cheyenne Bottoms, McPherson, and some of the other early water areas.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, any other questions for Tom?
Thank you.
Okay. Rich? I've asked this before. Coots have them little pads on their feet. Are they webless?
Kind of, sort of. We count them in regulations, Tom actually gets the cover them in there, but I put them somewhere in the middle.
All right.
I got it. Good. Thank you, Chairman Lauber and Commissioners. I have a short presentation to summarize some potential changes that we're recommending for sandhill crane season. It's been quite some time since we've had any recommended changes for this species, so I just thought I would start out by covering the general regulation and what's included in that. You can see there on the screen 115.25.20 is what we're talking about. And overall, for sandhill crane hunting in the state of Kansas, the area open to hunting covers about the western 2/3 or so of the state. We have a 58-day season, and that opens on the Wednesday after the first Saturday in November. Shooting hours currently sunrise to sunset, and we have a 3-bar bag limit, 9 possession. It does require the purchase of a sandhill crane hunting permit, and before you can purchase that permit, you're required to take an online sandhill crane hunting test, education test. And you can see here, this is a figure that shows the area open to sandhill crane hunting there in the western 2/3 of the state outlined in red there. So this is currently where you can hunt sandhill cranes in Kansas.
Since we started that season in 1993 was the first year for sandhill crane hunting. We've averaged 885 crane permits issued annually, and about a little less than half of those, 377 active crane hunters. I should note these numbers are available through Fish and Wildlife Service. They provide those on an annual basis based on the HIP surveys they do for crane hunters, just like other migratory bird species. And overall, our average harvest is 829 birds during that period on an annual basis. So as you might expect, if you know a lot about sandhill cranes in Kansas, the majority of the harvest does occur in the central part of the state, surrounding counties with their traditional crane stopover habitats. But harvest does occur further west as well. And you can see here with the accounting map for the state of Kansas, the blue is the outline of the crane hunting zone. And in the central part there, of course, that would be Stafford and Barton County there right in the middle of the state. Those are, particularly abundant sandhill crane migratory stopovers. And so that central and south central part of the state is where we see a significant component of sandhill crane harvest. However, I just wanted to point out that we do see some more in the western part of the state as well. So it's not primarily limited to those counties in the central part. So the reason I'm here today to talk about this regulation is a request that we receive quite frequently from crane hunters is to do a better job of aligning when the sandhill crane hunting season dates are and when crane migration occurs in the state of Kansas. And so what we've put together here is just a figure for a couple of different types of data streams that we have available to give us an indication of when cranes are present in Kansas. And so on the bottom here, all we see, this is just dates starting in September and going all the way through January. So the framework of dates we would have available for seasons. And then the two lines there just represent the two data sets. The black one is the information we collect as a state agency at some of our wildlife areas, as well as National Wildlife Refuges at Quivira, Kerwin, also collect this information. And then the red line there is represented by eBird. eBird is an online program that lots of folks, non-consumptive users, use quite a bit to keep track of when they're out birding, what they're seeing, where they're seeing it. And it's there's been, in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been quite an effort to try and compile a lot of that data and make it available and useful for different things. And this is a great example of that. So it provides another source of information of when cranes are being seen on the landscape in Kansas. And you can see overall these align relatively well. There is a bit of a lag here in that black line. We see cranes a little bit longer during our biweekly survey, and a lot of that abundance is related to birds that stick around on Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. And so the red line's probably a little better estimate for landscape wide across Kansas, and the black line is probably a little better estimate. They stay around a little bit longer on Quivira than some of the other places we see. But overall, generally, we're seeing the same type of thing, and we're starting to see cranes show up in early October, and generally by early to maybe mid-December, most of those cranes are through the state of Kansas. And when we compare that to, I overlaid, this blue is our general season framework. So this is when we're hunting sandhill cranes in the state. You can see that the request that we get is probably well-founded because the crane season is relatively late versus when the migration chronology of when the birds are present. For about the last quarter to a half of the season, there's actually not very many cranes that are present in the state. So when we look at information we can also get from the Fish and Wildlife Service for when people are out hunting cranes and when they're harvesting cranes, it's not surprising given that migration data. And you can see by the time December begins, hunting days out in the field and harvest are relatively minimal after that date. So most folks that are out hunting cranes are doing that early in the season, and that's when most of the harvest is occurring as well, which is not surprising given this last slide here of when the season aligns with the migration. So the question is, why is that? Why do we not do a better job of aligning the season dates to when the cranes are present? And it really it starts back to when we started hunting sandhill cranes. And we have made a decision since 1993. We have delayed the season opening to avoid any potential conflicts with whooping cranes because there is a component of the state where those two species overlap pretty significantly. Initially, the season in Kansas opened the first Saturday in November back in 1993, and that was through 2004. There was a whooping crane shooting incident you may have heard about or recall back outside of the Quivira, Stafford County area in 2004. And after that, KDWP&T further delayed the opening day of sandhill crane season to the Wednesday after the first Saturday. So starting in 2004. I think that should actually read since 2005. The opening day has remained that same Wednesday after the first Saturday in November. And that's the season framework we use. Crane regulations, just like all of our webless migratory game bird regulations, are permanent regulations, so we don't vote on it annually. It's in there, and the date has not changed. The opening framework has not changed. There, of course, are some implications to having a season date later than would be ideal for harvest. And I just put this slide in there just to show you the difference of just moving that season, on average, maybe 4 or 5 days or so. The lighter bars there represent what we're seeing for harvest and use after that, and the darker bars are prior to. So just that small amount of change has that much of an implication of reduction in harvest and permits out there. So if you think about, we already delay it to the first Saturday in November initially, and this is just a small delay. It's pretty significant, the effect that having season dates align with the migration, which Tom can probably attest to, because we talk about season dates for waterfowl all the time, and it's no different for sandhill cranes. What's interesting is during that same time period where we've delayed our sandhill crane seasons even later, starting in around 2005, this mid-continent population of sandhill cranes is the one we get through state of Kansas, has really taken off. And we're to the point now where there have been a number of surveys, and I think I've mentioned this to this commission previously, but we've gotten a number of surveys. We count these things during spring migration when they're using a stopover habitat primarily in Nebraska along the Platte River, but we're close to 1 million cranes in the sandhill crane mid-continent population. That's a lot of cranes. If you've ever been up there to Nebraska to see that population is doing quite well, and those are the birds that are coming through here during our hunting season as well. So we have a management plan for this population of sandhill cranes, and you can see the dotted lines there represent the low and the high of where we're trying to keep that population, and we're not doing a very good job right now. You can see where the population actually is represented versus those lines. So the question is then, there are plenty of cranes out there. We have some issues that we would have to work through, but are there changes that can be made? Can we better line season dates to when sandhill cranes are present? And so the request we typically get is just move the season dates. Seems pretty straightforward. There are a number of issues that are tied with that could make an overall change to season dates difficult. One being sandhill cranes are migratory game birds. Like all migratory game birds, we are working within frameworks and along with our partners at the Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is a change that the Fish and Wildlife Service has not been and is not in support of, a general move of our season dates earlier, with the same concerns about conflicts with whooping cranes being present in the state. So although this is probably the most it may seem as the most logical way, it's just change the season dates. There are some issues there as far as the Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned. There are also sandhill cranes are an issue that we always receive quite a bit of constituent input on. They are a species that lots of folks have a lot of passion about. And I suspect in addition to issues with Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Kansas, we would get a lot of negative feedback about this potential change if it were aligned in the same area as whooping cranes right now. What we are talking about and what I'm proposing today is actually an idea that we try and split apart this zone that we currently hunt sandhill cranes in and try and provide some season dates earlier in the year in areas where we actually don't see whooping cranes present. So try and balance out and trying to provide a little bit of both of those opportunities there on the landscape. And so what I have here in this figure is, again, this is the cranes unit we have right now, and then what I've overlaid here in these boxes is the whooping crane corridor. The U.S. Geological Service, the whooping cranes is probably one of the most well-studied species of migratory bird there is out there, given it's an endangered species. We're at right now the population, the Kansas wood buffalo population is a little over 500 birds. We know a lot about those birds. We know where they stop. We know where they breed. We know where they end up, stop over duration, types of habitats. And so that's really good news when we're trying to decide, okay, so where are these things spending time in the state of Kansas? And that's what these boxes really represent. They are marked by transmitters that communicate with satellite, so then we can see where they're stopping and we can produce these figures. And so what the pink boxes are these core use areas, and as they head north and south in Kansas, that's where they generally stop over. And then the bright red ones are the extended use core areas. And so of course those are the most important places for whooping cranes. And that one overlays with Stafford County and Quivira, which is where we see the large the large majority of whooping crane stopover. And then this is another refuge down here in Oklahoma. But we can see here is it's a predictable corridor through the central part of the state is where we see the very large majority of whooping crane use in the state. And so what we're proposing today to start the discussion is rather than keeping the entire sandhill crane unit as one, we could split that unit into west and central and then carve out this whooping crane corridor through the central part of the state. And then for the remaining part of the state over here in the west, create a new unit where we could adjust season dates to make it more feasible to when the migration of sandhill cranes occur. So, and that's what I just say here. With the creation of the west and central crane hunting zones, it would then be possible to adjust season dates in that west zone to better align with crane migration without increasing potential for whooping crane conflicts. So trying to meet both of those objectives at the same time. And as you can see here, all of the information we have from the U.S. Geological Survey here, all of those core areas fall in that central unit. The other thing I want to mention, and so that's what I start out with here, no whooping crane corridor extended use areas are included in that west zone. We also have an additional data set that's maintained by the Fish and Wildlife Service. When whooping cranes show up on the landscape as part of the whooping crane contingency plan, we report that information as soon as we find out about it, and we try and get that information out there so that when a whooping crane shows up at Quivira, at Cheyenne Bottoms, anywhere out in the landscape, we have a database of all of those that we have documented since 1961. So as an additional data set to trying to compare and look at that, when we look at that same, if we go back here to this west unit that I'm talking about over here, potential west unit, of all the observations reported in that database since 1961, less than 3%, so 2.5% were those were within that western unit. And that's actually improved to the point where within the last 10 years, there's only been 2 observations during the fall in that unit. So it seems like there has been a bit of a shift to go further east. So what I'm trying to express really here in this west unit is we're not seeing whooping cranes use that area for stopover in the state of Kansas. And so by splitting our crane hunting area into 2, we could see what we currently have here in the central unit for those season dates, and then we could look at something along these lines for the west unit so that we can provide an opportunity earlier in the season where we see those sandhill cranes coming through. And so that is our staff recommendation, is to revise the regulation 115-2520 to split the unit currently open sandhill craning hunting into a west and central zone. The west zone season recommendation would be to open the 3rd Saturday in October and run for 58 days consecutively, which is the amount of days we can have that season. No changes are proposed for that central unit, and that would be open the Wednesday after the 1st Saturday in November and run for 58 days consecutively as well. This is just some information that's included in your briefing book about what that boundary actually looks like. And I can just show you here on the map. You can see we're maintaining the same area close to sandhill crane hunting. The east boundary is the same as it has been before. So what we're talking about is this line right through here, which is generally 183. Down near the bottom here, it follows along Route 1 for a little while. And then we carve this area out up here around Webster because there is some core area up here that we wanted to avoid. And so this jogs over here to the west and meets up with 283 just to make that possible to avoid that area. So that language that's in there and it's in your briefing book item takes a long time to explain that same thing. So the status to date, I just wanted to mention, sandhill crane regulations, just like all migratory game bird regulations, they're subject to the same federal process. And so any changes to frameworks overall, zone guidelines, those types of things actually have to go through the Fish and Wildlife Service first. And so this isn't as straightforward as just we know what the frameworks are and we can make the change in any time, similar to what we're doing in the 5-year cycle for waterfowl. So currently this recommendation has already been through a good part of this federal process. And so at this point, I just wanted to mention that the other states and provinces of the Central Flyway, the migratory bird and whooping crane staff of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and probably most importantly here, the Service Regulations Committee, which is what makes the recommendation to go forward with these changes, has approved this change for us in the state of Kansas. So it will be available to us in the state of Kansas for 2020 if the commission chooses to make changes to state regulations accordingly. If not, we will stay with this, we can stay with status quo of where we're at. But if the commission chooses to make those changes, it will be something that we could take advantage of in the coming year. And I just wanted to end with just to provide a little bit of a summary here of the process and what we're recommending overall and what this means. And creating the West Zone with earlier in season dates is likely to increase hunter satisfaction and opportunity. And that's really one of the objectives we're trying to meet here. But it also actually has the potential, from my opinion anyway, to redistribute some of the hunter effort out of areas where whooping cranes typically occur. So what we're talking about is aligning the season where there are more cranes out there in the landscape in an area where we're not seeing whooping cranes. And so I fully suspect that we're going to see a bit of a redistribution for where people are hunting cranes to where it's best to do that.
Do we know now the allocation of the 879 permits between would be in the west and what would be in the central?
There is no specific allocation for, it's open region-wide.
It's open, but how many of the permits would be?
How many, as far as harvest?
Yeah.
I could look at that, and I could provide that for you at the next commission meeting. Yeah, I would say that a good majority of the birds are currently in that central unit, and I'll tell you what, I can go back to the figure I had here. So this is where their harvest is occurring in the state. And so this doesn't have absolute numbers, but you can see just by the darker boxes here, the majority, the number 1 and 2 are that's Stafford and that's Barton County there, and then the South Central there. So a good chunk of that is going to be occurring there right now. How much of that may be redistributed to the west is anyone's guess. But right now, I could come up with some numbers and what that actually looks like in the last few years and try and give you an estimate for that.
I was just curious how it split there.
Sure.
Another question, was there we know where the whooping crane are all the time, right?
Maybe not all the time. We know where they typically use, and there is some of the cranes are marked where we actually would know where they are. Our agency doesn't particularly follow that or know that information, but we know the areas where they normally stop over.
Would it be impractical, I think I know the answer, or was it considered opening season early and then having a closure when the whooping cranes are here?
Yeah, I will say the conversations the last time we went through this process, when we had the whooping crane shooting incident, I think that was something that there is a whooping crane contingency plan that is in place. And as part of that plan, that's the way it works now. So when whooping cranes show up on Cheyenne Bottoms, for example, generally there's an area of Cheyenne Bottoms that is closed to activities. Crane hunting is closed, light goose hunting is closed, and so those types of things do occur. And as part of that, Jamestown, I think last year or the year prior, had some whooping cranes show up, and so we do have things like that in place now already for those types of things. And I think those conversations did occur the last time we went through this process. It is something that we consider from a biological standpoint. I can tell you that I think we could actually move to the earlier season date across the region. And I don't think it would have a meaningful effect. We hunt when the species are co-occurring now, and we've done so successfully for a good amount of time. But what I was actually trying to get to in this slide a little bit is this represents a bit of a compromise, is trying to get at increasing that hunter satisfaction, providing that opportunity, but also trying to maintain the protection for the whooping cranes and provide those opportunities for people that appreciate those birds as well. So, maintaining that current season structure in the central zone continues to provide that protection. And then we're also not proposing any additional hunting of those birds. So, yes, I would say that could be an option. It would be a difficult option to pursue, both with the Fish and Wildlife Service and potentially in the state, but it is an option that would be available to us. That is, yes. Yeah, so with that, actually, that was all the information I had, and so I'd be happy to answer any other questions folks have.
Any other questions for Rich? Yeah.
Rich, I took a brief look at Oklahoma and Texas, and I just wonder about the trepidation of the service to not allow us to utilize the full frameworks when those two southern, it seems unfair to Kansas hunters when Oklahoma and Texas hunters have opportunity to hunt during peak migration times. And also they appear to have 90 days. Is our framework 90 days and we've just set it at 58?
My understanding is that the amount of days we have available for us to us in Kansas right now is 58 days. And so, when that decision was made, So I think it took at least three tries to get that sandhill crane season going in the state of Kansas, if I remember correctly. And so that's kind of where we ended up with on that initial request, and it has stayed that way. It would take a change to those frameworks, would be my understanding. Tom, does that sound right to you as well? Yeah. Yeah, so that's not saying it's an impossible thing to occur, and I don't disagree with you when you start adding the days up, and then you look at when whooping cranes are present in Oklahoma, when whooping cranes are present in Texas, and so this is an issue that we've faced that other states haven't necessarily faced as well, and so it does seem like a strange dichotomy in the way they're handling things with the service and the species. But for now, I think it presents at least some opportunity, but I don't disagree that there is some more opportunity that could be taken advantage of out there at some point, and it could be something we would pursue if that's the direction we'd like to go.
Thanks.
Sure.
I guess, Warren, if the sandhills aren't in your area at the time the season's open, most people won't go buy a permit. They just don't go buy the permit. But if they see the opportunity, like if there's sandhills out in our area, we'll go buy permits and go hunt them. Yeah. But if they come in October and the season's closed, we don't ever go buy a permit. So we don't even mess with it. But now there's an opportunity. Well, looks like they're there. We'll go take our tests and get our permits and go hunt them. So it's not something that you just buy it and then hope that they come. You wait for the opportunity.
I know. I hunt them.
Any other questions? Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
I was thinking about it. No, that's okay.
Surgically inside. You ready, Gerald?
Yep.
Okay. All right. I'm talking about antelope KR 115.25.7. I've presented this regulation several times already, and the only new thing I have to add today is that just in the last couple days, we've completed the Unit 17 and 18 winter aerial surveys. We've basically counted the same number as last year in Unit 17, which was 232. And we counted, the number continues to decline in Unit 18. We only counted 105, down from 135 last year, and it was in the 190s the 3 years before that. I'll be working with the biologists next week to try to come up with permit allocations in the units, and we'll have those available to the next meeting. Otherwise, the season structure and dates and all the other stuff in the briefing book there is the same and unchanged as it has been in previous seasons. So with that, I'll turn this back over to the commission.
Okay, any questions from commissioners? Any questions from the public?
Okay, elk is KR 115.25.8. I've also presented this regulation several times. The one new thing I would add today is the elk season on Fort Riley ended at the end of December. The elk that were reported to the fort as harvested were 11 out of the 12. Any elk permits were filled by antlered bulls, and 11 of the 18 antlerless elk permit tags were filled. And so harvest success rates were really good on the fort this year, and probably an indication that the population there continues to do real well. The rest of the state is still open, with the exception of Unit 1, which is the area around Cimarron National Grasslands, is still open to hunting through March 15th. So we're still a ways off of being able to have a complete season harvest summary. But regarding the recommendations in the briefing book, they too are unchanged from previous seasons, including the fact that we're proposing that 12 any elk permits and 18 antlerless elk permits be authorized for Fort Riley, And again, the rest of the state is pretty much open to, with the exception of Unit 1, again, the Cimarron area is open to over-the-counter permits by general residents or landowner tenants, specifically around Fort Riley. The general residents can't get them, but the landowner tenants can. So with that, I'll turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Matt from the commission? Any questions from the public?
Thank you.
Say what? I don't, did you have a question?
No.
No, okay. Thank you. All right, that ends this afternoon's agenda. We're going to recess, and we will reconvene here at 6:30.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Have a safe trip, Mr. Secretary.
Do a lot of guys hunt them?